I was hospitalized after suffering severe injuries at work. My husband filed for divorce before I could walk again, leaving me alone with our 3-year-old daughter. Then, he walked away with his mistress. 5 years later, he sued for full custody, but then the judge listed my sources of income. My husband went pale, stuttering that it was not possible. My name is Kiara Washington. I am 31 years old, and I am still healing from the deepest wounds the man I loved ever inflicted on me. As a successful commercial real estate appraiser in Atlanta, I built a solid life and provided the foundation my husband needed to launch his own career. But I had to learn the hard way that loyalty is just a word to people who only care about themselves. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic partner who drastically underestimated your worth. Growing up, I was taught that marriage meant standing by each other through sickness and health. I gave my entire heart to Julian Pierce. Julian was a wealth manager, a man who prided himself on his perfectly tailored suits, his extensive corporate network, and the image of absolute perfection he projected to the world. I thought his intense ambition was the sign of a provider, someone who wanted to build a beautiful life for me and our sweet 3-year-old daughter, Maya. I spent years supporting his dreams, smiling at his boring corporate events, and playing the role of the perfect supportive wife while maintaining my own demanding career. But the illusion of our perfect marriage shattered into a million jagged pieces on a Tuesday afternoon. I was conducting a routine appraisal at a new commercial development site in downtown Atlanta. It was supposed to be a standard walkthrough. I remember the smell of fresh concrete and the loud hum of construction machinery echoing across the lot. I was standing near the base of a massive steel scaffolding structure, taking notes on my clipboard, calculating the property value in my head. I never even heard the warning shout from the foreman. I only heard the deafening crack of snapping metal. I looked up just in time to see a massive shadow of falling steel blocking out the sun. Then came the crushing impact, a physical pain so intense it stole the breath completely from my lungs, and finally, absolute suffocating darkness. For 3 long days, I was trapped in a medically induced coma. In that dark, silent void, the only thing that kept my spirit fighting was the thought of my beautiful daughter, Maya. I kept seeing her bright smile and hearing her sweet little voice calling for me to come home. I fought through the heavy layers of unconsciousness because I knew she needed her mother. When I finally began to drift back into reality, the very first thing I registered was the rhythmic mechanical beeping of a hospital heart monitor. The sharp smell of harsh industrial bleach and sterile rubbing alcohol burned my nostrils. I slowly forced my eyes open, squinting against the blinding, sterile white lights of the intensive care unit. My throat felt like it was coated in sharp sand, raw and burning from the breathing tube that had recently been removed. But the physical pain in my upper body was absolutely nothing compared to the sheer terror rising from my lower half. There was a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my legs. I tried to wiggle my toes. I tried to bend my knees, but my body refused to respond. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized thick, rigid medical braces encased both of my legs. I was entirely numb from the waist down. The cold, terrifying realization that I might be completely paralyzed washed over me, leaving me trembling alone in the hospital bed. I desperately needed comfort. I needed the man who had promised to protect me. I needed Julian to hold my hand, to kiss my forehead, to tell me that everything was going to be all right, and that we would get through this tragedy together as a family. I turned my head, fighting through the agonizing stiffness in my neck, frantically searching the room for my husband. He was there, standing in the far corner of the sterile room, but he was not looking at me. He was not standing by my bedside, keeping a watchful vigil over his injured wife. Julian was facing the window, gazing out at the Atlanta skyline, dressed impeccably in his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. He had his phone pressed tightly to his ear, and his tone was dripping with intense, undeniable irritation. I strained to listen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my bruised ribs. He was talking to his mother, Vivian. Vivian was a woman who practically worshipped social status and wealth. She constantly reminded everyone of her elite sorority affiliations and her family lineage, always making sure to throw subtle, cruel jabs at my working-class background. She had never believed I was good enough for her precious son. I fully expected Julian to be giving her a somber, tearful update on my critical condition. Instead, the actual words that left his mouth made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. He let out a loud, frustrated sigh and complained, "Mom, you do not understand how incredibly embarrassing this is for me. I had the entire VIP lounge booked at the cigar club tonight. The senior managing partners were flying in. I was finally getting my promotion to senior director. And right when I am about to pop the champagne and make my big speech, I get a call that Kiara let a ton of scaffolding fall on her. Now I am stuck in this depressing intensive care unit smelling like cheap bleach while my colleagues are out celebrating my promotion without me. I lay there paralyzed, unable to move or speak, forced to listen to the man I loved complain that my near-death experience was nothing more than a scheduling conflict for his social calendar. He did not care that I was lying in a hospital bed with a shattered body. He did not care that our 3-year-old daughter was currently at home without her mother. He only cared about his missed party and how my terrible tragedy made him look to his rich friends. Tears, hot and thick, welled in my eyes and slid silently down my bruised cheeks. The absolute betrayal pierced my chest sharper than any physical injury I had sustained from the accident. I tried to swallow the heavy lump in my throat, opening my mouth to speak. My voice came out as a weak, raspy whisper. I just wanted a simple sip of water. I forced myself to call his name. Julian paused his conversation and slowly turned around. When his eyes finally met mine, there was no wave of relief. There were no tears of joy that his wife had finally woken from a terrifying coma. His face twisted into a mask of pure annoyance, as if my waking up was just another terrible inconvenience he had to deal with. He muttered something quick into the phone, telling Vivian he would call her back, and slipped the device into his expensive jacket pocket. He walked over to my bed, but he deliberately kept his distance, careful not to let his pristine suit brush against the hospital blankets. He looked down at me with cold, detached eyes. "You are finally awake," he said, his tone entirely devoid of warmth or compassion. "Do you have any idea what a logistical nightmare this week has been for me? I have been sleeping in uncomfortable waiting rooms and eating terrible hospital food. My leased Maserati is sitting in the parking garage, racking up $60 a day in fees because I cannot leave this place." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the absolute cruelty of his words. I had just woken up from a coma. I could not feel my legs, and my husband was complaining about parking fees for a car he could barely afford. I managed to push the words past my dry lips, telling him that I was scared, telling him that I could not feel anything below my waist. Julian rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, exasperated breath. He crossed his arms over his chest, looking at me like I was a burden he was entirely tired of carrying. "The doctor said you suffered severe spinal trauma, Kiara. They said you might be permanently paralyzed." He stated this life-altering, devastating medical news with the same casual annoyance one might use to report a delayed flight. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a harsh, resentful whisper. "Do you have any idea what this means for my career? I am a wealth manager. My entire livelihood is based on projecting an image of absolute perfection and success. I cannot be seen wheeling a disabled wife into corporate galas and elite charity dinners. It makes me look weak. It makes me look like a caretaker instead of a powerful leader. I am a director now, Kiara. I cannot have this dead weight dragging me down." Every single word felt like a physical blow to my face. The man I had vowed to spend the rest of my life with was looking at my broken body and seeing absolutely nothing but a threat to his public image. He did not see his faithful partner. He did not see the loving mother of his child. He only saw a broken accessory that no longer fit his glamorous, superficial lifestyle. The silence in the hospital room stretched on, suffocating and thick. I could hear the steady beep of the machines keeping track of my vitals, completely indifferent to the fact that my heart was breaking. I looked at Julian's perfectly manicured hands, the same hands that had slipped a wedding ring onto my finger and promised forever. Now those hands were clenched in frustration, eager to pull away. I asked him about Maya. I begged him to tell me if our daughter was safe, if she was confused, if she was crying for me at night. Julian barely blinked. He told me that his mother Vivian had taken Maya for the week. He said it with a tone that implied I should be grateful, but I felt a fresh wave of panic wash over me. Vivian despised everything about the way I raised my daughter. She constantly criticized my choices, claiming I was not grooming Maya for the high society life the Pierce family belonged in. Knowing my sweet, innocent girl was staying in a house where her mother was openly disrespected made my stomach churn. I tried to lift myself up, a desperate maternal instinct overriding my physical limitations, but the heavy braces anchored me to the bed. Julian took a step back, pulling his jacket tighter around himself, watching me struggle with a look of pure disgust. He did not offer a hand to help me. He did not try to ease my fears. He simply stood there, a cold, calculating stranger evaluating a bad investment. That was the exact moment the naive, loving wife inside me died, and a new, unbreakable woman began to take her first breath. The suffocating silence in the room was finally broken by the crisp rustle of heavy paper. Julian reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick beige manila envelope. He did not hand it to me respectfully. He simply dropped it, letting it land with a dull thud directly onto the sterile hospital blanket covering my motionless, braced legs. I stared at the envelope, my mind struggling to process this new indignity. I asked him what it was, my voice still raspy from the breathing tube that had recently been removed. Julian straightened his silk tie, his posture rigid with arrogant superiority. He looked down his nose at me, completely devoid of any human empathy. "Those are divorce papers, Kiara," he stated flatly, his tone as casual as if he were ordering a coffee. "Along with a full waiver of spousal support and any claim to my current assets. I expect you to sign them immediately." My breath caught in my throat. I looked from the envelope to his perfectly groomed face, searching for a trace of a cruel joke. There was none. I had just woken up from a devastating coma. My legs were completely paralyzed, and my husband was demanding a divorce before I had even spoken to a physical therapist. I asked him how he could do this, how he could throw away our marriage when I needed him the absolute most. Julian let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He leaned over the bed, his expensive cologne masking the sterile hospital scent. "I told you already," he hissed, his eyes narrowing with deep resentment. "I am a wealth manager. I deal in high-value assets and elite clientele. I do not push wheelchairs. You are a liability now, Kiara. A massive, glaring liability. My image is my currency. I cannot walk into a boardroom trying to close a $50 million portfolio while people are pitying me for having a crippled wife. You expect me to throw away my entire future to play nurse for you. That is not happening." He reached into his pocket again, pulling out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He uncapped it and forcefully shoved it into my trembling right hand. The hard metal dug into the purple bruises left behind by the intravenous needles. "Sign the papers, Kiara. You have no savings to fight me. You have no working legs. You are entirely defenseless. If you make this difficult, I will drag this out in court until you are drowning in so much legal debt you will never recover. Just sign the waiver and let me get on with my life." Before I could even formulate a response to his breathtaking cruelty, the heavy wooden door of the intensive care unit swung wide open. The sharp, aggressive clacking of high heels echoed against the linoleum floor. In walked my mother-in-law, Vivian Pierce. She was draped immaculately in her signature pink and green colors, a proud and loud display of her sorority affiliation. In her manicured hands, she clutched a pristine gold-embossed designer Bible, a prop she wielded to project an image of righteous grace while hiding her utterly rotten core. Right behind her sauntered Tasha, Julian's younger sister, swinging a counterfeit luxury handbag with the logos completely misaligned and chewing gum with loud, obnoxious smacks. Neither of them looked at the terrifying metal braces encasing my legs. Neither of them gasped at the dark, swollen bruises covering my face and arms. Instead, they looked around the hospital room with expressions of absolute distaste, as if my near-death experience was a personal inconvenience to their busy Sunday schedules. Vivian turned back toward the hallway and snapped her fingers. "Bring her in here," she barked. A moment later, a weary-looking hospital volunteer wheeled a stroller into the room. Inside sat my sweet 3-year-old daughter, Maya. Her tiny face was red and streaked with fresh tears. Her beautiful dark curls were tangled, and she was crying frantically, calling out for me. The sound of her distressed sobs tore right through my chest. Vivian marched over to the stroller. Instead of comforting her own granddaughter, she grabbed Maya by the arms, hauled her up, and literally dropped the crying toddler directly onto my chest. I let out a sharp gasp of agony as Maya's weight hit my bruised ribs, but my maternal instincts instantly overrode the blinding physical pain. I wrapped my weak, trembling arms around my baby girl, burying my face in her messy curls, whispering that Mommy was right here. Vivian stood at the foot of my bed, looking down at us with a sneer that twisted her heavily made-up face. She adjusted her pink cardigan, her eyes flashing with malicious triumph. "I always told Julian you were never meant for our world," she declared, her voice dripping with venomous elitism. "You thought that fake degree and that cheap little real estate job made you one of us. You can dress up a working-class girl in designer clothes, but you cannot wash away the poverty in her blood. The Pierce family is a dynasty, Kiara. We come from doctors, lawyers, and elite socialites. You came from a cramped apartment on the south side. You are nothing but a stepping stone Julian used before he found a real woman." She tapped her gold-embossed Bible against the metal railing of my bed. "God always has a way of putting people back in their rightful place," she preached, twisting religion to justify her cruelty. "You climbed too high trying to latch onto my son's success. Now look at you, broken, destitute, and exactly where you belong. You are nothing but a tragic charity case. Julian deserves a woman who can stand beside him at the country club, not a burden who needs her food pureed." I glared at her, clutching Maya tighter against my chest. My daughter buried her face into my hospital gown, terrified of the loud, angry women surrounding us. I wanted to scream. I wanted to order them out of my room. But the crushing reality of my paralyzed legs and my empty bank accounts held the words hostage in my throat. They knew exactly how vulnerable I was, and they were feeding on my helplessness like starving vultures. Tasha strutted forward, pushing past her mother to stand directly over me. She crossed her arms, snapping her gum loudly. "You really thought you hit the jackpot with my brother, did you not?" she mocked, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. "Well, the ride is officially over. We are done pretending you belong in our family circle." Tasha's greedy eyes darted downward, locking instantly onto my left hand. There, resting against the white hospital sheets, was my diamond wedding band. It was a beautiful 2-carat custom ring that Julian had purchased back when he was actually trying to impress me. Tasha's eyes widened with naked, unapologetic greed. Without a single word of warning, Tasha lunged forward. She grabbed my left wrist with a harsh, aggressive grip. I cried out in pain as her sharp nails dug into the tender, bruised skin surrounding my intravenous lines. "What are you doing?" I gasped, trying to pull my hand away. But my body was too weak from the trauma of the accident and the lingering effects of the coma. Tasha ignored my cries entirely. She dug her fingers into my skin and forcefully yanked the diamond ring right off my finger. The violent friction scraped my knuckle, leaving a bright red mark in its wake. She held the sparkling diamond up to the harsh fluorescent light, admiring it with a greedy, wicked smile. "You definitely do not need this anymore," Tasha sneered, slipping the stolen ring into her cheap designer pocket. "You are not a wife anymore. You are a patient. I will take this to the pawn shop downtown. Consider it your contribution to covering the ridiculous hospital bills you are racking up by lying here. The Pierce family does not finance dead weight." I looked over at Julian, fully expecting him to stop his sister from brazenly robbing his injured wife in a hospital bed. Instead, Julian casually checked the time on his Rolex watch. He nodded in absolute agreement with Tasha's blatant theft. "She has a point, Kiara," he said coldly. "That ring is a Pierce family asset. You have not earned the right to keep it. Now stop stalling. Sign the divorce papers and the spousal waiver. If you sign them right now, I will generously pay for the medical transport van to take you to whatever low-income public housing facility will accept you. They stood around my bed, a united front of absolute toxicity and ruthless greed. Julian, the narcissistic husband demanding a divorce. Vivian, the elitist mother-in-law preaching judgment. Tasha, the petty sister stealing jewelry off a crippled woman's hand. They expected me to break down. They expected me to sob uncontrollably, to beg Julian for a second chance, to plead for their mercy and financial support. They wanted to watch me crumble into a pathetic, helpless mess so they could feel entirely superior. But as I lay there, feeling the warm, steady heartbeat of my 3-year-old daughter pressing against my chest, a profound and terrifying calmness washed over my entire being. The hot, frantic tears that had been building in my eyes suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. The intense physical pain radiating through my shattered legs vanished beneath a massive surge of adrenaline. I did not scream. I did not beg. I did not shed a single tear for the man who was standing in front of me. I looked at Julian, memorizing the exact curve of his arrogant smirk. I looked at Vivian, burning the image of her fake, judgmental sneer into my brain. I looked at Tasha, noting the exact way she patted her pocket where my stolen ring rested. I took a deep, steadying breath. I reached out with my trembling, bruised right hand, and I grabbed the heavy gold fountain pen Julian had thrown at me. I pulled the manila envelope onto my chest, resting it right beside Maya's tiny back. I flipped to the back page of the divorce decree, finding the line demanding the waiver of spousal support and the immediate dissolution of our marital assets. Julian's smile widened into a victorious grin. "That is a good girl," he mocked, leaning back on his expensive Italian leather shoes. "See how easy things can be when you finally accept your place in the world." I did not respond to his taunts. I simply pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed my name with sharp, aggressive strokes. I signed away my right to his money. I signed away my connection to his toxic family. I signed away the last remaining shred of weakness I held in my heart. I tossed the signed papers back at him. They slid across the slick hospital blanket and fluttered onto the floor near his feet. Julian eagerly bent down to snatch them up. He inspected the ink, making sure every letter was legible, ensuring his escape route was perfectly paved. He let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief, acting as if he had just escaped a terrible prison sentence. "Let us go, Mom," Julian instructed, turning his back on me without a second thought. "I have wasted enough time in this miserable room. Chloe is waiting for me at the apartment." The mention of another woman's name should have stung, but my heart was already locked behind a fortress of pure ice. Vivian adjusted her pink cardigan, offering me one final look of utter disgust before turning on her heel. Tasha snapped her gum, gave me a sarcastic little wave, and followed her mother out the door. Julian was the last to leave. He paused at the threshold, not to say goodbye to his 3-year-old daughter, but to adjust his silk tie in the reflection of the glass door. Then, without a single backward glance, he walked out, leaving me entirely alone with my paralyzed legs and my crying child. They thought they had destroyed me. They truly believed they had left a broken, destitute woman lying in that hospital bed to rot. They had absolutely no idea that their profound cruelty had just ignited a fire so intense it would eventually burn their entire fake, luxurious world right to the ground. I held Maya tightly against my heart, rocking her gently as the sound of their arrogant, clacking footsteps faded down the hospital hallway. 6 grueling weeks passed in that sterile rehabilitation center. Every single day was an agonizing battle against my own broken body. I endured hours of intensive physical therapy, pushing through blinding pain just to learn how to transfer my dead weight from a hospital bed to a metal wheelchair. My legs remained completely unresponsive, a constant heavy reminder of the falling steel that had crushed my physical independence. But my mind was sharper than ever. I focused every ounce of my energy on getting back to my daughter. Maya was the only light in that dark, suffocating tunnel. Vivian had only allowed her to visit me twice, and both times my mother-in-law stood in the corner, loudly complaining about the depressing hospital smell while constantly checking her diamond watch. Finally, the doctor signed my official discharge papers. I was given a lightweight manual wheelchair and a terrifying stack of medical bills that made my stomach churn. A medical transport van picked me up on a humid Tuesday morning. Maya sat securely on my lap, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around my neck, humming a happy little song because she was finally going home with her mommy. I stared out the tinted window of the van as we drove through the familiar tree-lined streets of our upscale Atlanta suburb. I felt a small, fragile spark of hope. I thought about the custom nursery I had designed for Maya, the comfortable bed waiting for me, and the sanctuary of the home I had poured my heart and my income into decorating. The van pulled up to the curb of my house. The driver lowered the hydraulic lift, carefully rolling my wheelchair down onto the concrete driveway. He wished me luck, climbed back into the driver's seat, and drove away, leaving me sitting at the bottom of my own driveway. I took a deep breath of the warm summer air. I gripped the metal hand rims of my wheelchair and began the exhausting physical struggle of pushing myself up the sloping concrete path toward the front door. My arms burned with the unaccustomed exertion, but I refused to stop. Maya cheered me on, her sweet voice giving me the strength to push over the slight lip of the front porch. I rolled right up to the heavy mahogany door, the exact door I had spent weeks picking out from a custom builder. I reached into my purse with trembling fingers and pulled out my house key. I slid the metal key into the brass deadbolt lock. I turned my wrist, expecting the familiar, satisfying click of the lock disengaging. Instead, the key stubbornly refused to turn. I pulled it out, wiped it on my shirt, and tried again, thinking I had just inserted it at the wrong angle. It jammed completely. The internal pins did not align. My heart skipped a beat, a cold wave of dread washing over my chest. I tried the bottom handle lock. It was completely frozen. The locks had been changed. A sudden sharp panic seized my throat. I raised my fist and began knocking heavily on the thick wood, the sound echoing loudly in the quiet suburban neighborhood. I knocked again, calling out Julian's name, demanding that he open the door. I heard the muffled sound of footsteps approaching from the inside. The brass deadbolt slid back with a loud, heavy thunk. The door swung inward. Julian stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. He was dressed in casual but obnoxiously expensive weekend clothes, wearing a smug, relaxed expression that made my blood boil. He looked down at me sitting in the wheelchair, his eyes sweeping over my simple clothes and the medical equipment keeping me upright. He did not look surprised to see me. He looked deeply inconvenienced. Before I could demand to know why my key did not work, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the grand foyer and wrapped her arms around Julian's waist. My breath completely vanished from my lungs. Standing right beside my husband was a young, striking woman who could not have been older than 28. She had long, perfectly styled blonde extensions, heavy eyelash extensions, and was holding a smartphone attached to a glowing ring light. But that was not what made the air turn into sharp glass in my throat. This absolute stranger was wearing my robe. It was a blush pink custom-tailored silk robe that I had ordered straight from Italy for our 5th wedding anniversary. My embroidered initials were monogrammed right there on the breast pocket. This woman was casually lounging in my house, wrapping her manicured hands around my husband, draped in my most intimate, expensive clothing. Julian did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Kiara," he said, his voice flat and unapologetic. "I see you found a ride. I told you to sign those papers quickly so we could avoid this exact awkward encounter. Meet Chloe Jenkins. We have been waiting for you to come collect your remaining junk." I stared at Chloe, my hands gripping the armrests of my wheelchair so tightly my knuckles turned pure white. I demanded to know what was going on. I demanded to know who this woman was and why she was wearing my clothes in my house. Julian let out a cruel, condescending laugh. He looked at Chloe, sharing a private joke before looking back down at me. "Chloe is not just a guest, Kiara," he stated, his eyes completely devoid of guilt. "She is my partner. We have been together for 2 full years. 2 years. The words hit me like a physical punch to the face. My mind frantically raced backward. 2 years meant he had been sleeping with this woman while I was recovering from childbirth. It meant he was leaving our bed, kissing my cheek, and driving straight to her. My entire marriage, the foundation of my life, had been a calculated, disgusting lie. He had been planning his exit long before the scaffolding ever fell on me. Chloe giggled, a high-pitched grating sound that echoed perfectly in the grand foyer. She completely ignored the fact that I was sitting there paralyzed, holding a terrified toddler who was burying her face into my neck. Chloe held up her smartphone, angling the ring light to perfectly illuminate her face, making sure my wheelchair was visible in the background of her shot. She pouted her lips, took a rapid series of selfies, and then looked directly into my eyes with an expression of pure, unadulterated malice. "Do not look so shocked," Chloe sneered, adjusting the collar of my silk robe to expose her shoulder to her online followers. "Julian is a high-value man. He needs a woman who can keep up with his active lifestyle. If you cannot keep a man on his feet, I will gladly keep him on his toes." She laughed again, a cruel, mocking sound, and pointed her long acrylic nail down at the rubber tires of my wheelchair. Plus, she added, wrinkling her nose in disgust, "We just had the contractors finish installing those new Brazilian hardwood floors you always wanted. Your clunky metal wheelchair will absolutely scratch them up, and Julian spent way too much money making this place look perfect for my social media background aesthetics." I was shaking with a rage so profound it literally blurred my vision. I demanded that Julian step aside. I demanded that he pack up Maya's clothes, her toys, and my important financial documents. I told him he had absolutely no right to lock me out of the home we shared, the home I had helped build. Julian's smug smile only widened. He stepped forward, leaning against the doorframe, projecting absolute, unwavering authority. "Actually, I have every legal right," he stated coldly, his eyes turning to stone. "You seem to have forgotten that the deed to this property is entirely in my name. I purchased this house before we got married. You were just a guest here, Kiara. A guest whose welcome has officially expired. This is my private property and you are currently trespassing." I raised my voice, refusing to back down. I reminded him that my steady income had paid for the mortgage, the expensive kitchen renovations, and the very hardwood floors his mistress was currently standing on. I told him he could not leave his disabled wife and his child stranded on the concrete porch. Julian simply pulled his latest model smartphone from his pocket. He did not engage in my argument. He swiped the screen, dialed 3 single digits, and lifted the phone to his ear. I watched in absolute horror as the man I had loved weaponized the police against me. "Yes," Julian said into the receiver, his voice instantly shifting into the calm, highly professional tone of a concerned, law-abiding citizen. "I need an officer dispatched to my residence immediately. I have a disgruntled ex-wife trespassing on my private property. She is refusing to leave the premises and is actively harassing me and my partner. Yes, she is in a wheelchair. No, she is not welcome here, and she is causing a severe disturbance. I ask that you send a squad car to have her formally removed from my property." He lowered the phone and looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with total victory. "You have exactly 10 minutes before the cops arrive, Kiara. I suggest you roll away before they arrest you in front of your daughter." He reached out, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and slammed the heavy oak door directly in my face. The deadbolt clicked loudly into place, locking me out of my own life. I sat completely motionless on the wet concrete of the front porch, the sharp echo of that deadbolt ringing in my ears like a gunshot. My fingers gripped the cold metal rims of my wheelchair. Before I could even turn the chair around to navigate back down the sloping driveway, the heavy oak door suddenly swung inward just a few inches. Julian stood there, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the grand foyer. He held my everyday leather purse, the one I had left resting on the entryway table the morning of my accident. He tossed it carelessly out the door. It landed heavily on the hard concrete, sliding to a stop, directly against the rubber tire of my wheelchair. "By the way," Julian stated, his voice completely hollow and devoid of any human empathy, "do not bother checking the joint savings account. I went to the bank yesterday and emptied it. I transferred all $50,000 into a private offshore account solely in my name. My lungs seized. That $50,000 was everything. It was the money I had painstakingly saved from every single commercial real estate appraisal, every late-night report, every extra weekend shift I had worked over the past 5 years. It was specifically set aside for Maya's future, her college fund, and our emergency safety net. It was the culmination of my blood sweat and relentless ambition. Consider it my honeymoon fund with Chloe. Julian added a cruel, mocking smirk, twisting his lips. You will not see a single dime of it. Have a nice life, Kiara. He slammed the door shut again. The deadbolt engaged with brutal finality. I was left staring at the beautiful, imposing facade of the home I had helped finance, entirely locked out of the life I had built. The sky above Atlanta, which had been heavy and a suffocating, oppressive gray all morning, finally broke open. A low, threatening rumble of thunder rolled across the manicured suburban streets, vibrating right through the concrete beneath my wheels. It was immediately followed by the first fat, heavy drops of rain. Within seconds, the sky unleashed a torrential, blinding downpour. Cold summer rain soaked my simple clothes instantly, plastering my hair to my face and chilling me straight to the bone. Maya began to whimper, the cold rain hitting her delicate face and mixing with her tears. The loud thunder terrified her, and she buried her face deeper into my neck, her tiny hands gripping my shirt with desperate, panicked strength. I immediately pulled off my light jacket entirely, ignoring the sharp, agonizing pain shooting through my unhealed ribs and my battered shoulders. I draped the jacket completely over her tiny body, pulling the fabric tight to create a waterproof cocoon. I tucked her securely against my chest, shielding her from the violent storm, wrapping my arms around her to share my body heat. I reached down with a trembling, bruised hand and picked up the wet leather purse Julian had discarded like trash. I balanced it on my lap, shielding it from the rain as best as I could with my arms, and unzipped the main compartment. I pulled out my wallet, my fingers slipping on the wet leather. I flipped it open, praying for a miracle, praying for a hidden reserve I had somehow forgotten about. I found exactly $40 in cash, two crumpled $20 bills. I frantically checked the card slots. My debit cards and credit cards were gone. I dug deeper into the bottom of the purse and felt the sharp, jagged edges of plastic. Julian had meticulously cut every single one of my bank cards into tiny, unusable pieces and dumped the shards back into the bag. He had completely financially executed me. That $40 was my entire net worth. I was a 31-year-old disabled woman sitting on a wet concrete curb in the middle of a massive thunderstorm. I had paralyzed legs, no home, no car, no credit, and a terrified 3-year-old child clinging to my chest. I looked around at the neighborhood, the perfectly manicured lawns, the luxury cars parked in expansive driveways, the beautiful brick houses standing tall and secure against the rain. A sleek black Mercedes drove slowly past my house. I recognized the driver as my next-door neighbor, a corporate lawyer who had attended our dinner parties and drank our expensive wine. He looked right at me, sitting in my wheelchair in the pouring rain. He made direct eye contact. Then he quickly looked away, rolling up his tinted window and accelerating down the street. In this elite, image-obsessed neighborhood, nobody got involved in other people's messy, uncomfortable scandals. I was entirely invisible to them now. I was a problem they preferred to ignore. A normal person would have broken down right there on the curb. A normal person would have sobbed into the rain, screamed at the sky, or pounded on that heavy mahogany door, begging for just a little bit of mercy. They would have pleaded for shelter, for their money, for a scrap of basic human decency. But as the freezing rain washed over my face, mixing with the dirt and the exhaustion of the hospital, the last remaining drops of my despair were washed away completely with it. A profound, unnatural calmness settled deep into my chest. It was a cold, hard sensation, replacing the panic and the fear with something made of pure, unbreakable iron. I refused to shed a single tear for Julian Pierce. I refused to give him the satisfaction of looking through the peephole and seeing me broken. I looked up at the massive, imposing front door of the house, Through the large living room window, I saw the silhouette of Chloe standing in my silk robe, laughing, holding a glass of wine, completely unbothered by the fact that a disabled woman and a toddler were trapped in a storm just feet away. I held Maya tighter, resting my chin against the top of her covered head, and I made a silent, unbreakable vow to myself and to my innocent daughter. I will make you beg for everything you took from us. I promised myself right then and there that I would not just survive this betrayal. I would rise from this wet concrete and I would build an empire so massive it would cast a permanent shadow over their entire pathetic existence. I would tear down Julian's perfect corporate image. I would completely dismantle the wealth he valued more than his own family. I would make Vivian choke on her elitist pride, and I would make Tasha regret the day she ever laid her greedy hands on me. I would make them all feel the exact same absolute terrifying helplessness that they had forced upon me today. I pulled my cell phone from the inner waterproof pocket of my purse. Miraculously, the screen lit up, glowing brightly through the heavy rain. I knew calling the police was entirely useless. Julian's name was indeed the only name on the deed, a manipulative financial move he had insisted upon before our wedding, under the guise of protecting our assets. I had no physical proof of his financial crimes, no proof of the stolen savings account, right here on the curb. Calling my former friends was also out of the question. Julian had spent the last 2 years systematically isolating me, feeding our social circle subtle lies about my mental state, and claiming I was becoming increasingly unhinged and difficult to manage. They would believe the successful wealth manager over the hysterical disabled wife. I needed a truly safe place. I needed a place entirely outside of his elite social circle, a place where his money and his influence held absolutely no power. I opened the web browser, my fingers slipping on the wet glass of the screen, and searched for an emergency domestic violence shelter in the greater Atlanta area. I found a 24-hour crisis hotline. I dialed the number, pressing the phone tightly against my ear to hear over the roaring thunder. The phone rang twice before a woman answered. Her voice was warm, steady, and highly professional. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to remain completely calm and devoid of any emotional cracking. I explained my situation with brutal clarity. I stated that I was physically disabled from a recent severe workplace accident. I explained that I was stranded outside in a thunderstorm with a 3-year-old child and that my husband had completely locked me out of my home and emptied all of my financial accounts. The operator did not judge. She did not ask unnecessary probing questions about how I had let this happen or why I did not just call a family member. She immediately recognized the textbook signs of severe financial and emotional abuse. She simply asked for my exact location and told me an emergency transport vehicle was already being dispatched. She instructed me to stay exactly where I was and assured me that help was on the way. I ended the call and tucked the phone back into the safety of my purse. I sat in the pouring rain for 20 agonizing minutes. The physical toll on my recovering body was immense. The heavy medical braces encasing my paralyzed legs felt like solid lead weights pulling me down, making my lower half ache with phantom pains and intense pressure. The cold was seeping into my joints, making my bruised ribs throb with every single breath I took. But I kept my arms locked firmly around my daughter, using every ounce of my upper body strength to keep the heavy rain off her small frame. Maya had eventually stopped crying, lulled to sleep by the exhaustion of the day and the rhythmic sound of the heavy rain hitting the jacket covering her. Finally, a set of headlights cut through the dark, stormy afternoon. An unmarked, discreet white transport van pulled up to the curb, its tires splashing through the deep puddles rushing down the street. The side door slid open, and a kind-faced woman wearing a bright yellow raincoat stepped out, holding a massive golf umbrella. She rushed over to my wheelchair, immediately holding the umbrella over me and Maya blocking the relentless assault of the rain. She did not offer empty platitudes or pitying looks. She simply asked if we were ready to go. I nodded, pulling my wet purse onto my lap. The driver of the van lowered a heavy hydraulic lift down to the sidewalk. The woman expertly assisted me in maneuvering my wheelchair onto the metal platform, making sure my tires were securely locked in place. As the mechanical lift slowly raised me into the dry, warm, brightly lit interior of the van, I turned my head and looked back at the house one final time. The front door remained completely shut. The living room window was now dark, the curtains pulled tightly closed against the storm. Julian had cast me out into the rain, thoroughly convinced he had won the battle. He firmly believed he had completely destroyed me, leaving me with nothing but $40 and a broken body. He had absolutely no idea that he had just started a war he could not possibly win. I rolled into the back of the transport van, the door sliding shut behind me, completely cutting off the sound of the storm. The driver handed me a thick, warm blanket, which I immediately wrapped around my sleeping daughter. I wiped the cold rainwater from Maya's forehead, kissing her warm cheek. We were stripped bare, entirely exiled from the life we knew, left with nothing but the wet clothes on our backs. But we had survived the worst day of our lives. And as the van drove away from that toxic neighborhood, taking me toward my grueling rehabilitation, I knew that mere survival was just the very first step toward my absolute vengeance. The transport van dropped us off at a sprawling gray brick building that served as both a domestic violence shelter and a low-income rehabilitation clinic. The facility smelled of cheap pine cleaner boiled cabbage and quiet desperation. It was a million miles away from the custom hardwood floors and vaulted ceilings of the home I had just been thrown out of. But as the heavy security doors locked behind me, providing a safe barrier between my daughter and the monster who fathered her, I felt a deep sense of relief. This gritty linoleum-floored room was not a prison. It was my war room. My recovery began the very next morning. The doctors at the hospital had warned me that my spinal trauma was severe and that walking again was a highly unlikely miracle. They told me to accept my new reality. But they did not understand the fuel that was currently burning inside my chest. Every time I looked at Maya sleeping soundly on the narrow twin bed beside my wheelchair, the fire flared hotter. My physical therapy sessions were nothing short of medieval torture. Every afternoon, an aggressively cheerful therapist named Brenda would wheel me into a gym filled with intimidating metal equipment. She hoisted me up between two heavy steel parallel bars and strapped a thick leather gait belt around my waist. The goal was simple, but seemingly impossible. I had to force my completely numb dead legs to support my own body weight. For the first few weeks, my legs simply buckled like wet paper. The pain of the atrophied muscles tearing and straining was agonizing. I would grip the cold steel bars until my palms blistered, tears of pure physical anguish streaming down my face, my sweat soaking completely through my cheap cotton t-shirts. I collapsed over and over again. But every single time my knees hit the padded floor, I saw Julian's arrogant smirk. I saw Chloe posing in my custom silk robe. I saw Tasha stealing my wedding ring, and I hauled my battered body right back up. I refused to let them win. I refused to raise my daughter from a seated position. Months of agonizing, relentless repetition slowly began to yield results. A faint tingle in my left toe became a twitch became a flex became the ability to lock my knee. Through sheer, terrifying willpower, I was forcing my severed nerve endings to rebuild their connections. By my 4th month in the facility, I took my very first unassisted step. By my 5th month, I was walking with a cane. I hid my miraculous progress from everyone outside the clinic walls. As far as Julian and his toxic family were concerned, I was still the helpless, paralyzed victim they had discarded on the curb. I needed them to believe I was completely powerless. While my body was enduring physical warfare, my mind was busy executing a meticulous financial strike. I was not just a grieving ex-wife. I was one of the most ruthless, highly trained commercial real estate appraisers in the entire city of Atlanta. I knew building codes, zoning laws, structural engineering reports, and contractor supply chains better than anyone else in the business. And I knew exactly why that massive steel scaffolding had collapsed on me. I set up a makeshift office on a folding card table in the corner of my tiny shelter room. I requested an emergency meeting with a personal injury attorney named Marcus Vance. Marcus was a hungry, aggressive lawyer who operated out of a cramped strip mall office next to a laundromat. He was exactly the kind of gritty, no-nonsense fighter I needed. When he sat down at my folding table, he looked at my cane and my modest surroundings with a heavy sigh, clearly expecting a standard low-payout worker compensation claim. I quickly corrected his assumption. I slid a thick, carefully organized binder across the table. I did not just hand Marcus a tragic story. I handed him an irrefutable, fully documented roadmap of corporate negligence. I explained to Marcus that the commercial developers had intentionally cut corners to meet a strictly penalized deadline. I directed him to subpoena the specific shipping manifests from the steel supplier. I knew based on my appraisal notes from the day of the accident that the construction company had quietly swapped out high-grade load-bearing American steel for cheap substandard imported materials that were never properly rated for the sheer weight of that scaffolding. Furthermore, they had entirely bypassed the mandatory municipal safety inspections, bribing a low-level city official to look the other way so they could keep the project moving. Marcus's eyes widened as he flipped through my meticulous notes cross-referencing the building codes I had highlighted. I handed him the exact names of the site foreman to depose and the specific municipal files to request during the discovery phase. I basically handed him a loaded weapon aimed directly at the heads of a billion-dollar development firm. When Marcus filed the massive lawsuit, the developers initially tried to crush us. They sent a swarm of high-priced corporate attorneys in custom suits completely identical to the ones Julian wore to intimidate me. They threatened to drag the case out for a decade. But when Marcus casually presented my detailed findings during the very first preliminary deposition, the arrogant smiles vanished from the corporate lawyers' faces. They knew instantly that I had them backed into a corner. If this case went to a public jury trial, the resulting media scandal would force the city of Atlanta to completely revoke their building permits. It would trigger a massive federal investigation, halt construction on their flagship skyscraper, and cost their investors hundreds of millions of dollars in catastrophic losses. They could not afford the bad press. They absolutely could not afford me. 3 weeks later, the developers and their massive insurance conglomerate requested a highly confidential, off-the-record mediation session. We met in a sterile, glass-walled boardroom high above the city. Their lead attorney did not even try to negotiate. He simply slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table. It was a settlement offer, $3 million, tax-free, paid entirely in a single lump sum in exchange for an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and my immediate silence. Marcus looked at me, his hands actually trembling with excitement. He knew this was a massive, unprecedented victory. I looked at the number on the page. $3 million was more money than Julian could ever dream of managing in a single portfolio. It was generational wealth. It was absolute power. I picked up a pen, keeping my expression entirely blank, and signed the agreement. When the enormous settlement check finally cleared into a brand new, highly secured bank account, I did not immediately go out and buy a luxury mansion. I did not buy a flashy sports car or cover myself in designer clothes. That is exactly what a foolish, arrogant person like Julian would do. Showing off my newly acquired wealth would only alert my ex-husband and his greedy family that I was no longer the helpless victim they had thrown away. They would immediately come sniffing around for a handout, claiming they were entitled to a portion of my money. I needed to remain completely invisible. I needed to build my empire entirely in the shadows. Instead of living lavishly, I moved Maya and myself into a modest 2-bedroom brick ranch house in a quiet working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta. I furnished it with comfortable, unassuming pieces. I bought a reliable 10-year-old used Honda sedan. I dressed in simple, off-the-rack clothing. To the outside world, and specifically to anyone connected to Julian, I maintained the perfect illusion of a struggling single mother surviving on meager government disability checks. But behind the closed doors of my modest brick house, I became a phantom titan of the Atlanta real estate market. I used a small portion of the settlement money to hire an elite corporate attorney who specialized in asset protection. Together, we formed a completely anonymous blind trust and a heavily guarded shell corporation. I named it K&M Holdings for Kiara and Maya. My name appeared on absolutely zero public records. I was the silent, invisible CEO. Armed with my $3 million war chest and my unmatched knowledge of commercial appraisal, I went to work. I did not buy overpriced luxury condos or flashy downtown high-rises. I targeted a very specific, heavily neglected industrial district in Atlanta. It was an area filled with crumbling strip malls, abandoned warehouses, and rundown apartment complexes. Most investors completely ignored the area, viewing it as a hopeless wasteland. But my appraiser's mind knew a secret that the rest of the market had not caught on to yet. I knew that the city of Atlanta was quietly finalizing plans for a massive multi-billion-dollar infrastructure expansion that would run a brand new transit line directly through the heart of that exact district. Within 5 years, that ignored wasteland would become the most highly sought-after, rapidly gentrifying real estate in the entire state. Operating entirely through my anonymous shell corporation, I began buying up every single undervalued commercial property I could get my hands on. I bought dying strip malls for pennies on the dollar. I purchased massive empty warehouses in cash. I acquired dozens of heavily distressed apartment buildings, quickly renovating them to attract the incoming wave of young professionals who were starting to flock to the gentrifying area. I was ruthless. I was efficient. I was a ghost. I worked 18-hour days negotiating deals through my lawyers, flipping commercial zones, and aggressively compounding my investments. Every single profit went directly back into acquiring more property. K&M Holdings expanded at a terrifying exponential rate, quietly consuming entire city blocks. I was building a fortress of unimaginable wealth piece by piece, brick by brick, all while driving my beat-up Honda and living in my quiet suburban house. I was making sure that when the time finally came to confront the man who had left me to die in the rain, I would not just be standing on my own 2 feet. I would be standing on top of a mountain of power he could not even begin to comprehend. 5 years later, the humid Atlanta heat hit my face as the heavy tinted door of my black armored SUV swung open. A sharply dressed personal security guard immediately extended a hand, but I completely ignored it. I stepped out onto the pristine pavement of the financial district, the sharp, authoritative click of my Christian Louboutin heels cutting through the ambient noise of the bustling city. My legs, once crushed and condemned by top medical experts to a lifetime trapped in a metal wheelchair, were completely and miraculously healed. The agonizing bone-deep pain of physical therapy, the thousands of hours spent falling and forcing myself back up on padded gym floors, had forged my muscles into pure iron. I stood at my full height, perfectly balanced, staring up at the gleaming 40-story skyscraper of glass and steel that housed the executive command center of K&M Holdings. My building, my empire. I walked through the revolving glass doors. The massive marble lobby was a testament to absolute power. I bypassed the main reception desk entirely and entered my private secure elevator, swiping a highly encrypted biometric keycard. As the silent elevator shot up to the top-floor penthouse suite, I looked at my reflection in the polished mirrored doors. I was no longer the helpless weeping woman discarded on a wet concrete curb with exactly $40 to my name. I was a phantom titan, the anonymous CEO of the most aggressive real estate acquisition firm in the entire Southeast. I stepped off the elevator and strode directly into my massive corner office. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. Much of that skyline now belonged entirely to me. Over the past 5 years, I had ruthlessly executed the master plan I had formed in the shadows of that gritty rehabilitation clinic. My anonymous shell corporation had swallowed up dozens of luxury apartment buildings, sprawling commercial plazas, and prime development plots in the city's most rapidly gentrifying districts. I had taken the $3 million settlement from the construction developers and turned it into an unstoppable financial juggernaut. My lead acquisitions director, a brilliant and ruthless lawyer named Marcus, was already waiting at my custom mahogany desk. He did not speak a single word as I sat down in my high-backed leather chair. He simply handed me a stack of highly classified acquisition dossiers. I opened the first folder to review our latest hostile takeover. I looked at the cover sheet and instructed Marcus to hand me the file named A1_12.docs, so I could review the aggressive zoning variances we had just secured from the City Council. Next to it sat the file named A2_12.docs, which detailed the complete financial dismantling of a rival commercial plaza we were quietly buying out from under Julian's own wealth management firm. I flipped through the staggering multi-million-dollar profit projections housed in the file named A3_12.docs, and finally took my solid gold fountain pen to sign my formal approval on the file named A4_12.docx. With those 4 signatures, I had just acquired another massive sector of the downtown commercial district, tightening my invisible grip around my ex-husband's professional territory. I ruled this empire with an iron fist, but I remained entirely a ghost. Only Marcus and a handful of elite, heavily vetted executives knew my true identity. To the rest of the business world, the CEO of K&M Holdings was a terrifying, faceless entity. I checked the diamond-encrusted watch on my wrist. It was exactly 2:45 in the afternoon. My time as a ruthless corporate titan was up for the day. I stood up, walked into my private executive washroom, and began the daily, highly calculated transformation. I stripped off my tailored designer suit jacket and my expensive silk blouse. I kicked off the Christian Louboutin heels. In their place, I pulled on a pair of faded generic blue jeans and an oversized, slightly worn cotton sweater. I tied my hair back into a messy ponytail and wiped away my sharp, immaculate makeup. I traded the red-soled heels for a pair of scuffed, sensible white sneakers. Within 10 minutes, the intimidating billionaire CEO was completely gone. I looked exactly like an exhausted, struggling single mother. I took a hidden service elevator down to the subterranean parking garage, bypassing the fleet of luxury armored SUVs. Parked in a dark, forgotten corner was my 10-year-old slightly dented Honda sedan. I tossed my canvas tote bag onto the passenger seat, turned the ignition, and drove out of the financial district, slipping seamlessly into the heavy afternoon traffic. This elaborate daily facade was not a game. It was a strict, non-negotiable layer of armor designed entirely to protect my 8-year-old daughter Maya. Julian Pierce was a greedy, narcissistic monster. If he ever discovered that the crippled wife he had thrown into the rain was now sitting on a mountain of generational wealth, he would instantly launch a vicious, heavily funded legal war for full custody of Maya. He did not care about our daughter, but he cared deeply about money. He would use Maya as a pawn to drain my accounts and destroy my peace. I refused to let his toxic, arrogant presence anywhere near my child. I pulled the rattling Honda up to the curb of Maya's public elementary school. The school was a modest, older brick building, though nobody knew that a mysterious, anonymous donor had recently funded a state-of-the-art computer lab and a brand-new music wing. I parked behind a line of expensive luxury SUVs, driven by the neighborhood PTA mothers. I stepped out of my car, plastering a tired, apologetic smile on my face. A group of wealthy mothers stood near the school entrance holding designer coffees and wearing expensive tennis outfits. When they saw me approach in my faded jeans and scuffed sneakers, they offered me condescending, pitying smiles. The PTA president, a woman draped in expensive jewelry, stepped forward and loudly offered me a discounted ticket to the upcoming school bake sale, making sure everyone around us heard her act of charitable grace. I accepted the ticket with extreme humble gratitude, keeping my eyes cast downward in perfect submission. They truly believed I was a tragic charity case surviving entirely on food stamps and government handouts. They had absolutely no idea that my anonymous trust effectively owned the massive commercial plaza where they bought their overpriced lattes every single morning. The school bell rang and Maya ran out the heavy double doors. She was 8 years old now, a bright, thriving, incredibly happy child with a wild mane of dark curls and a laugh that could light up the darkest room. She threw her arms around my waist, nearly knocking me backward. I caught her easily, my heeled legs planting firmly on the concrete, and swung her up into a tight hug. We walked hand in hand back to the dented Honda, ignoring the whispered gossip of the other mothers. As we drove back to our modest, unassuming 2-bedroom brick house on the outskirts of the city, Maya chattered happily about her science project. Our home was simple, filled with comfortable, cheap furniture and colorful finger paintings stuck to the refrigerator. It looked exactly like the home of a woman barely scraping by. It was the perfect fortress. While Maya sat at the kitchen table doing her homework, I opened my laptop and checked my hidden financial dashboards. I reviewed the child support ledger monitored by the state. The balance showed exactly $0.00. Julian had not paid a single dime of child support in 5 entire years. He had aggressively ignored every single court order, hiding his massive income behind a labyrinth of elite accountants and offshore accounts. He firmly believed I was completely powerless to fight him. He told his wealthy country club friends that I was still a worthless cripple, rotting away in some depressing low-income housing project, cashing meager government disability checks just to feed his unwanted child. He bragged openly about how easily he had discarded me, presenting himself as the victim of a burdensome disabled wife who had tried to drag down his high-value lifestyle. He was still living with Chloe, parading her around social media as his perfect trophy. They posted endless photos of their lavish vacations, their expensive dinners, and their brand new luxury cars. They still lived in that same massive house, walking on the Brazilian hardwood floors they had installed, while I was fighting to learn how to walk again. They were living in a blissful, arrogant delusion, absolutely convinced they had won the war. They were entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality closing in around them. They had no idea that K&M Holdings had systematically purchased the commercial building that housed Julian's elite wealth management firm. They had no idea that I was quietly buying up the debt portfolios of his largest, most lucrative clients. They did not know that the phantom billionaire slowly suffocating their entire financial ecosystem was the exact same woman they had mocked, robbed, and locked out in a thunderstorm. I closed my laptop and poured Maya a glass of juice. I looked around my modest kitchen, feeling the immense crushing weight of the power I held in my hands. The 5 years of grueling physical agony, the endless nights of plotting in the shadows, and the meticulous daily performance of the struggling single mother were all about to pay off in spectacular fashion. I had built the cage entirely around Julian, without him ever noticing a single bar being dropped into place. The trap was fully set. The execution was ready, and I was finally prepared to step out of the shadows and watch his perfect, arrogant world burn to ash. Across town, inside the cavernous walls of the house Julian had proudly claimed as his sole property, the ash was already beginning to fall. The pristine Brazilian hardwood floors that Chloe had been so terrified of scratching were now deeply scuffed and littered with a mounting pile of brightly colored past due notices. Julian sat slumped over the massive marble kitchen island, an empty glass of cheap bottom-shelf scotch resting near his trembling hand. He stared at the glowing screen of his laptop, his bloodshot eyes scanning a bank account balance that hovered dangerously close to zero. The elite wealth manager, the man who had built his entire identity on projecting financial superiority, was drowning in an ocean of inescapable debt. His downfall had not been a sudden dramatic explosion. It had been a slow, agonizing bleed entirely orchestrated by his own greed and his desperate need to maintain an illusion. He had lost his prestigious job at the wealth management firm 6 months ago. The partners had called him into a closed-door meeting, presenting him with a stack of forensic accounting audits. Julian had been caught embezzling client funds. He had siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from the accounts of elderly investors, desperately trying to keep up with Chloe's insatiable, ravenous appetite for a luxurious lifestyle. The firm had offered him a brutal ultimatum. They would not press federal charges, avoiding a massive public relations scandal, but he had to quietly resign, surrender his entire legitimate portfolio, and sign a non-disclosure agreement that effectively blacklisted him from the financial industry forever. While Julian sweated through his designer shirt in the kitchen, Chloe was in the adjacent living room, entirely oblivious to the financial guillotine hovering over their heads. She had a bright ring light set up, aiming her smartphone camera at a pile of orange and brown luxury boxes. She was loudly narrating a fake unboxing video for her stagnant social media followers. She pulled a pristine leather handbag from a dust cover, squealing with manufactured delight, bragging about how her incredible partner loved to spoil her. Julian squeezed his eyes shut, a sharp pain throbbing in his temples. Every single bag in that video was a high-tier counterfeit. Chloe had maxed out 6 different credit cards under Julian's name just to buy convincing fake designer goods from overseas suppliers. She refused to accept their new reality. She demanded expensive dinners they paid for on credit-scheduled lavish spa days and threw apocalyptic tantrums whenever Julian suggested they needed to cut back on their spending. Her influencer image was her entire world, and she was perfectly willing to drag Julian into absolute bankruptcy to maintain the aesthetic. The heavy oak front door swung open without a knock. Vivian Pierce marched into the foyer, her signature pink and green cardigan looking slightly frayed around the edges. She clutched her gold-embossed Bible like a weapon, her face pinched into a tight mask of barely concealed panic. Right behind her, dragged Tasha, aggressively popping a piece of cheap bubblegum, holding a counterfeit designer bag of her own that she had begged Chloe to order for her. Vivian slammed her purse down onto the entryway table, the sound echoing through the tense house. She marched straight into the kitchen, ignoring Chloe's loud request for quiet while filming. Vivian glared at Julian, her eyes darting to the empty scotch glass and the stack of red envelopes littering the marble island. "We have a massive problem, Vivian," hissed her voice, trembling with the terrifying realization that their social standing was evaporating. "The country club just declined my credit card for the monthly membership dues. They humiliated me in front of the entire Ladies' Auxiliary Committee, Julian. The manager pulled me aside and told me our account is severely delinquent." Julian let out a bitter, exhausted breath. He slammed his laptop shut. "The country club is the least of our problems, Mom," he snapped, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. "The mortgage on this house is 4 months past due. The bank sent the final warning yesterday. If I do not come up with $40,000 by the end of the month, they are initiating foreclosure proceedings. We are going to be living on the street." Tasha stopped chewing her gum. Her eyes went wide with sudden selfish panic. "You cannot lose this house, Julian. I just told my new boyfriend we were hosting a pool party here next weekend. You have to fix this." "Fix it," with what Julian yelled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I have no job. I have no savings. Every single credit line is maxed out. I cannot even afford the electricity bill next month, let alone a $40,000 mortgage payment. We are completely out of options." Chloe paused her recording, finally registering the shouting. She strutted into the kitchen, crossing her arms defensively. "Well, you need to figure something out, Julian," she whined, tapping her acrylic nails against her arm. "I am not moving into some depressing cheap apartment. My followers expect a certain standard of living. If you lose this house, I am packing my things and leaving. I did not sign up to be poor." Julian glared at her, pure resentment replacing his usual infatuation. "You are the reason we are poor, Chloe," he spat back. "You spent our last $10,000 on a fake vacation to Miami just so you could post photos from a rented yacht." Before a full-blown screaming match could erupt, Vivian slammed her hand flat against the marble island. "Silence," she barked, her eyes flashing with a cold, desperate calculation. "The Pierce family does not go bankrupt. We do not lose our homes, and we absolutely do not let ourselves be humiliated by debt collectors. There is always a loophole. There's always a way to secure capital." Vivian began to pace the length of the large kitchen, her elitist brain perfectly trained in the art of manipulation, and exploiting the vulnerable was working in overdrive. She muttered to herself, calculating assets, looking for anyone they could manipulate. Suddenly, she stopped dead in her tracks. A slow, wicked smile spread across her heavily made-up face. Her eyes lit up with a dark, predatory gleam. "I have it," Vivian announced, turning to face Julian with absolute triumph. "I know exactly how we get the money to save the house and maintain our lifestyle." Julian looked up, a desperate spark of hope fighting through his alcohol-fueled haze. "How?" Vivian leaned forward, placing her manicured hands flat on the table. "Kiara." Julian scoffed, rolling his eyes and sinking back into his chair. "Kiara is a paralyzed cripple living in a low-income housing project, Mom. She has absolutely nothing. She probably survives on canned soup and government handouts. How is she going to save us? Exactly, Vivian hissed, her smile widening into something truly sociopathic. She is a disabled, unemployed woman living on government assistance, which makes her completely unfit to raise a child. Julian frowned, not following her twisted logic. What does Maya have to do with the mortgage? Vivian let out a sharp, frustrated sigh, treating Julian like a slow child. You sue Kiara for full exclusive custody of Maya, she explained, her voice dripping with venomous elitism. Think about it, Julian. No judge in the state of Georgia is going to let a struggling, paralyzed woman living on welfare keep a child when the father lives in a beautiful suburban mansion and has a history of corporate success. We present you as the stable, loving father. Once a judge grants you full custody, we immediately petition the court for child support. Tasha let out a loud, harsh laugh, catching on to the scheme. Oh, this is brilliant. Yes, Vivian continued, her eyes practically glowing with greed. The state will automatically garnish whatever pathetic disability checks Kiara receives and send that money directly to you. But that is just the beginning. Once Maya is legally your dependent, you can claim her on your taxes. We can apply for emergency family assistance programs, single father tax credits, and dependent benefits. We can forge the paperwork using Maya's social security number to open fresh lines of credit. It will generate thousands of dollars in immediate capital, more than enough to stall the foreclosure and buy us time to figure out another plan. Julian stared at his mother, the sheer ruthless cruelty of the plan slowly sinking in. He had not seen or spoken to his daughter in 5 years. He felt absolutely zero paternal affection for Maya. He viewed her as a massive inconvenience, a noisy burden he had gladly left behind on the curb. But looking at the stack of past due notices, his greed quickly overpowered whatever microscopic shred of human decency he had left. It will cost money to file the custody paperwork, Julian muttered, his resolve already weakening. We need a lawyer to draft the initial petition, and I have absolutely zero cash to pay a retainer. Vivian reached up and unclasped the heavy antique gold necklace from around her throat. She tossed it onto the marble island, followed by a thick gold bracelet and a diamond cocktail ring. I will take these to the pawn shop downtown first thing tomorrow morning, she stated firmly. It will be enough to cover the initial filing fees and get a ruthless family court lawyer on retainer. We will bleed that crippled girl dry. Chloe clapped her hands together, a bright manic energy returning to her face. Oh my God, this is actually perfect, she squealed, grabbing her smartphone and checking her reflection. I can totally rebrand myself. I will do a whole series on being a young, glamorous stepmother, rescuing a child from a broken home. Mommy vlogger content gets massive engagement. Brands will send us free clothes and toys for her. I can easily monetize the kid. Tasha snapped her gum loudly, crossing her arms with a wicked smirk. I cannot wait to see the look on Kiara's face when the court servers show up at her depressing little apartment. She probably thinks she got away from us. It is going to be so satisfying watching you take her kid away and leaving her completely, entirely alone. Julian looked at the gold jewelry resting on the marble counter. He thought about the foreclosure notices, the declining credit cards, and the suffocating pressure of his ruined career. He looked at his mother, feeling a surge of arrogant confidence returning to his chest. He firmly believed the narrative he had created. He believed Kiara was a weak, destitute woman, confined to a metal wheelchair, entirely defenseless against his superior intellect and social standing. Do it, Julian commanded, slamming his hand down on the island with a renewed sense of power. Pawn the jewelry, hire the most aggressive lawyer you can find. We are taking full custody of Maya, and we are going to drain Kiara for every single cent she gets from the government. They stood around this kitchen island, a unified front of absolute toxicity, greed, and breathtaking delusion. They congratulated themselves on their brilliant strategy, already imagining the money they would steal and the pain they would inflict. They laughed, entirely blinded by their own arrogance. They had absolutely no idea that by filing that custody petition, they were not attacking a helpless, paralyzed victim living in a slum. They were intentionally kicking down the front door of a phantom billionaire. They were gleefully walking right into the center of the trap Kiara had spent 5 relentless years building, and they were about to trigger a financial slaughter that would obliterate their entire existence. 2 weeks after Vivian pawned her antique jewelry to fund their malicious scheme, The atmosphere inside the executive penthouse boardroom of K&M Holdings was electrically charged. I sat at the head of a massive custom-carved obsidian table, surrounded by 12 of my highest-ranking executives and the sharpest legal minds in Atlanta. We were in the final, agonizing minutes of closing a $20 million acquisition. The target was a sprawling, highly coveted commercial block right in the center of the downtown tech corridor, a property that would solidify my absolute dominance over the city's real estate market. The opposing negotiating team sat across from us, sweating through their expensive tailored suits, completely outmaneuvered, financially cornered, and mentally exhausted by my relentless demands. I kept my expression entirely blank, a mask of cold, unyielding authority. The lead negotiator for the opposing firm wiped his forehead with a linen handkerchief, stammering through a final, desperate plea for a slight increase in our buyout offer. I let his words hang in the sterile, air-conditioned air of the penthouse suite. Silence was one of my absolute favorite weapons. I watched him squirm under the heavy pressure, knowing with absolute certainty that I held all the leverage. I tapped my solid gold pen against the polished stone table a single time, signaling my absolute refusal to yield a single penny more. Just as the defeated executive let out a heavy sigh and reached for his pen to sign the surrender documents, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. My private executive assistant, a fiercely competent and highly trained woman named Sarah, stepped into the room. Her sudden appearance was highly irregular. I maintained a strict zero-interruption policy during major acquisition closures. Everyone in the room froze instantly, sensing the severe break in protocol. Sarah walked swiftly around the perimeter of the table, her heels completely silent on the thick luxury carpet. She stopped right beside my high-backed leather chair and leaned down. She placed a thick, sealed manila envelope directly onto the table in front of me. She kept her voice to a barely audible whisper, informing me that a court process server had bypassed building security by claiming it was an extreme time-sensitive legal emergency regarding a minor child. They had aggressively insisted the documents be delivered directly into my hands, threatening to call the police if they were denied entry. I dismissed Sarah with a slight calm nod, my face remaining completely impassive. The opposing executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging nervous glances, wondering if this sudden legal interruption would derail our $20 million deal. I did not give them the satisfaction of showing even a fraction of an emotion. I picked up the thick envelope, sliding my gold letter opener under the heavy paper flap with a sharp, satisfying tear. I pulled out a thick stack of official legal documents printed on heavy stock paper. I recognized the formatting immediately from my own grueling divorce proceedings 5 years ago. It was a formal petition for a modification of custody filed in the Fulton County Family Court. I flipped to the second page, my eyes instantly catching the name of the petitioner printed in bold black ink, Julian Pierce. A dark, quiet thrill washed over me as I read the aggressively worded legal jargon. Julian and his bargain bin attorney had crafted a narrative of pure delusional fiction. According to the petition, Julian was a thriving, highly successful wealth management executive, residing in a multi-million-dollar suburban estate, offering a perfectly stable, luxurious, and enriching environment for a growing child. The document painted him as a deeply concerned, loving father who had recently discovered the supposedly horrific living conditions of his daughter and was stepping in as her ultimate savior. I read further, my eyes scanning the list of outrageous, entirely manufactured demands. Julian was petitioning for immediate full physical and legal custody of Maya. But the true motivation behind the desperate lawsuit was buried deep in the financial addendums attached to the back of the packet. Julian was formally demanding that the court order me to pay him exactly $2,000 every single month in child support. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the claim was almost hilarious. The legal brief aggressively described me as an unfit, impoverished, disabled mother. Julian's lawyer had included pages of insulting, fabricated claims stating that I was living in a state of severe physical and financial neglect. They claimed my supposed physical limitations made it impossible for me to provide basic care, safety, or emotional support for an active 8-year-old girl. They passionately argued that Maya was in immediate danger of falling into systemic poverty, and that she desperately needed to be rescued by her wealthy, capable father and his glamorous, supportive partner, Chloe. I sat at the head of the table, where I was literally seconds away from signing a $20 million commercial real estate check, reading a legal document that called me destitute, crippled, and helpless. The irony was so rich and potent I could practically taste it on my tongue. Julian was currently drowning in inescapable debt, facing imminent foreclosure and completely unemployed after being fired for embezzlement. Yet he had the absolute unwavering nerve to demand $2,000 a month from a woman he genuinely believed was surviving on government food stamps. He was actively attempting to weaponize our innocent daughter to save his own sinking ship and fund his mistress's fake designer handbag addiction. I did not panic. My heart rate did not increase by a single beat. I did not feel a shred of the terror or intimidation Julian was desperately hoping to inflict upon me. Instead, a cold, predatory smile slowly touched the corners of my mouth. I had spent 5 years waiting for Julian to make a fatal, irreversible mistake. I had built a fortress of wealth and power in total secrecy, waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike back. By filing this lawsuit, Julian had just hand-delivered the exact weapon I needed to destroy him entirely on the public record. I looked across the expanse of the obsidian table. Sitting directly opposite me was Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, and the same relentless legal shark who had helped me secure my initial $3 million settlement 5 years ago. Marcus knew my entire history. He knew about the tragic accident, he knew about Julian's horrific betrayal, and he knew exactly how much raw, unchecked power I currently wielded in the city of Atlanta. I slid the thick stack of court documents across the smooth surface of the table. The papers glided perfectly, coming to a stop right in front of Marcus. He picked them up, his sharp, analytical eyes scanning the first page. I watched his expression change from professional curiosity to profound, dark amusement. He looked up at me, one eyebrow raised in silent disbelief at the sheer stupidity of the man attempting to sue us. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair, folding my hands elegantly in my lap. I spoke clearly, my voice carrying a quiet, terrifying authority that demanded absolute attention from every single person in the boardroom. Let them play their little game. I want to see how loudly they sing before I cut their vocal cords. Marcus let out a low, dangerous chuckle. He carefully folded the custody petition, placed it inside his designer leather briefcase, and snapped the lock shut. The opposing executives sitting at the table looked visibly unnerved by the cold, intense exchange, completely unaware of the personal warfare unfolding right in front of their eyes. I turned my attention back to the terrified lead negotiator across the table. I tapped my pen one final time. The man practically scrambled to sign the $20 million acquisition documents, desperate to finalize the deal and escape the sudden, suffocating intensity of my boardroom. Once the acquisition was fully executed and the opposing team had rushed out of the penthouse, I dismissed my executives. Only Marcus remained behind. He pulled the custody petition back out of his briefcase, spreading the pages across the table to analyze their specific legal angles. They hired a strip mall attorney, Marcus noted, tracing his finger over the law firm's cheap letterhead. This guy handles low-tier, high-volume divorces. They definitely pawned something just to afford his basic retainer. The claims in this petition are aggressively stupid, Kiara. They are demanding a full financial discovery phase to prove you are impoverished and reliant on the state. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the sprawling, sunlit city of Atlanta. Financial discovery. I repeated, the cold smile returning to my face. That is exactly what we are going to give them, Marcus. But we are going to do it entirely on my terms. Julian had voluntarily entered a legal arena where absolute financial transparency was mandatory. By demanding a monthly child support payment, he had kicked open the door for a family court judge to heavily scrutinize both of our financial backgrounds. He arrogantly assumed he could easily hide his massive, crippling debt behind his fake luxury lifestyle. He assumed my financial discovery would reveal absolutely nothing but a miserable, empty bank account and a stack of meager disability checks. We are going to play the role of the helpless victim perfectly, I instructed Marcus, turning away from the window to face him. When the preliminary hearing is scheduled, I will attend exactly as Julian expects to see me. I will wear the faded cheap clothes. I will drive the beat-up dented Honda. I will let him strut around the courtroom in his tailored suit, acting like the generous savior of the year. I want him to feel incredibly confident. I want him to believe he has already won the case before the judge even hits the gavel. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a brutal legal slaughter. And what about your financial disclosures? We bury everything behind the shell corporations, I said smoothly, outlining the trap. To the family court, my personal checking account will reflect the exact narrative we have maintained for 5 years. Modest income, strict budgeting, and a quiet, unassuming lifestyle. We will comply fully with the initial discovery requests, showing them a woman who is barely making ends meet. Let Julian and his greedy mother salivate over the idea of garnishing my non-existent welfare checks. But the moment Julian steps onto the witness stand, I continued, my voice dropping to a deadly, unwavering whisper. The moment he swears under oath that he is a wealthy, capable provider. That is when we spring the trap. We are going to subpoena his actual financial records. The foreclosure notices on his house. The maxed-out credit card debt Chloe has accumulated. The termination papers from his wealth management firm. He had built his entire life on a fragile, paper-thin illusion of superiority. I was going to rip that illusion away in a highly public courtroom, leaving him completely exposed, financially humiliated, and utterly ruined. File the response to the petition, Marcus, I ordered, walking back to my desk to gather my things. Do not contest his request for a hearing. Agree to the court date immediately. Let them think we are terrified and rushing to surrender. Marcus smiled, sliding the documents back into his briefcase. It will be a bloodbath, Kiara. They have absolutely no idea what is coming for them. No, they do not, I agreed softly, looking one last time at the city skyline I practically owned. They think they are hunting a wounded animal. They do not realize they just walked into the lion's den. I grabbed my canvas tote bag and headed for the private executive washroom to begin my daily transformation back into the invisible, struggling single mother. The war was officially back on, and this time, I held every single weapon in my arsenal. The morning of the deposition arrived with a suffocating, muggy Atlanta heat. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, carefully reviewing my armor for the day. I slipped into a faded, oversized gray cardigan that had begun to pill noticeably at the elbows. I paired it with loose, unflattering denim jeans and the exact same scuffed white sneakers I wore to Maya's elementary school. I brushed my hair into a limp, messy bun at the nape of my neck and completely bypassed my makeup vanity, allowing the natural dark circles from my late nights of corporate acquisitions to show through. I looked defeated. I looked exhausted. I looked exactly like the broken, impoverished victim Julian desperately needed me to be. Marcus met me outside the generic glass-fronted building of the opposing law firm. He was an elite, high-powered corporate shark, but today he was playing a role right alongside me. He wore a slightly rumpled suit he had bought off the rack specifically for this occasion. He carried a battered leather briefcase bursting with disorganized loose papers. We looked like a desperate single mother and an overworked bargain bin attorney entirely out of our depth. We walked into the sterile, heavily air-conditioned conference room. The suffocating smell of cheap cologne and expensive perfume hit me instantly. Julian sat at the center of the long table, leaning back in his chair with an air of absolute unearned arrogance. He wore a flashy, tailored suit that I knew he could not actually afford, a desperate attempt to project the wealth he had already lost. Next to him sat his lawyer, a sharp-featured, aggressively loud man named Vance, who operated a high-volume, low-quality divorce mill. In the corner of the room, arranged on a row of uncomfortable plastic chairs, sat Julian's personal cheering section. Chloe was perched on the edge of her seat, holding a counterfeit designer handbag on her lap. She had her smartphone propped up against a coffee cup, the camera lens pointed directly at me. She was poorly hiding the fact that she was recording the deposition, no doubt gathering content for a viral social media video about dealing with a broke, toxic baby mama. Beside her sat Vivian and Tasha. Vivian wore her signature pink and green, her eyes scanning my faded cardigan with naked disgust. As I pulled out my chair to sit next to Marcus, the whispering began. Tasha leaned into Vivian, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my feet. "Look at those hideous sneakers," Tasha hissed, her voice loud enough to echo across the silent room. "She literally looks like she just crawled out of a dumpster." "I cannot believe Julian ever touched that." Vivian let out a harsh, condescending laugh. "It is pathetic," Vivian whispered back. Her eyes locked on my plain canvas tote bag. She could not even afford a proper attorney. "Look at that clown sitting next to her. They are going to get absolutely crushed." I kept my head bowed, my shoulders slumped in a posture of complete submission. I let the insults wash over me. Their arrogance was blinding them to reality. The deposition began with Vance slamming a thick stack of papers onto the table. He leaned aggressively forward, attempting to intimidate me with his sheer volume. "We are here to establish the undeniable fact that you are entirely unfit to provide a stable, enriching, and financially secure environment for Maya Pierce." Vance barked, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "Let us start with your living situation. You reside in a small, outdated two-bedroom property in a low-income sector, correct?" I looked up, letting a brief flash of manufactured hesitation cross my face. "I live in a modest brick house," I answered softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "It is safe and comfortable." Vance let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Modest is a very generous word," he sneered. "My client lives in a multi-million-dollar secure suburban estate with a pool and top-tier security. He offers an environment of absolute privilege. You, on the other hand, are currently unemployed and surviving on government assistance, are you not?" Marcus shuffled his papers, frantically playing the part of the disorganized, overwhelmed lawyer perfectly. He offered a weak, entirely unconvincing objection regarding the aggressive tone of the questioning. Vance ignored him completely, his eyes locked on me. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, refusing to break character. "I have income that meets all of my needs and Maya's needs," I stated vaguely. "I am fully capable of providing for her daily expenses." Julian snorted loudly from across the table. He leaned over to Vance, a cruel, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "She means her disability checks," Julian whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. "She is living off taxpayer handouts. The state pays for her groceries." Vance nodded enthusiastically, ready to twist the knife further. "Let us discuss your physical capabilities," he continued, flipping to a new page in his file. "You suffered a catastrophic spinal injury 5 years ago. You were told you would never walk unassisted again. How exactly do you plan to chase after an active 8-year-old child when your own medical records state you are permanently disabled?" I took a slow, deep breath. I knew exactly what my medical records stated. I also knew that those records were 5 years old, and that my anonymous trust had completely scrubbed any recent medical updates from the public databases. They had absolutely no idea that I ran 5 miles every single morning. I chose my words with absolute terrifying precision. "My physical state is exactly what the established medical records reflect," I answered truthfully. "I manage my condition through sheer willpower and strict daily routines. I am fully capable of being an active presence in my daughter's life." In the corner, Chloe let out a loud, obnoxious scoff. She picked up her phone, turning the screen slightly to frame her own face. She whispered dramatically into the microphone, making sure to capture the audio of my quiet, subdued voice. "You guys, it is so sad watching people refuse to accept reality," she murmured to her imaginary followers. "Like, just give the kid to the parent who can actually afford to give her a good life. Some people are just so toxic and selfish." Vivian nodded in agreement, leaning forward to add her own commentary. "It is child abuse, honestly," Vivian stated, her voice sharp and cruel. "Forcing a bright young girl to live in squalor just because you want to play house. Julian is doing the Lord's work by rescuing her from that depressing little shack." Vance slammed his hand on the table again, refocusing the deposition. "We have reviewed your initial financial disclosures," he said, pulling up a thin, single-page document. "This document showed the balances of my decoy checking accounts containing just enough money to pay for groceries and basic utilities. It was a perfectly crafted illusion. You have 0 significant savings, 0 investment portfolios, and zero viable assets. You are one unexpected medical bill away from total financial ruin. How do you intend to fund a child's future? Her college tuition, her extracurricular activities, when you cannot even afford a decent pair of shoes? Tasha giggled in the corner, thoroughly enjoying the brutal interrogation. I looked down at my scuffed white sneakers, then back up at Vance. I maintain a strict budget, I replied, my voice steady, though I forced my hands to tremble slightly on the table. Financial security is about managing what you have, not flashing what you do not own. Julian's face flushed with sudden defensive anger. He took my comment as a direct insult to his lavish, entirely counterfeit lifestyle. Financial security is about having actual wealth, Julian snapped, leaning aggressively over the table. Something you know absolutely nothing about. I can give Maya the world. I can put her in private schools. I can take her on international vacations. You can barely afford to keep the lights on in that pathetic little brick house. You are holding her back, Kiara. You are drowning, and you are trying to drag my daughter down with you. I looked Julian directly in the eyes. For a split second, the facade of the terrified, broken victim slipped. I let him see a tiny, razor-sharp flash of the ruthless predator lurking just beneath the surface. I do not drag people down, Julian, I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing all its previous hesitation. I wait for them to sink themselves. Julian blinked momentarily, taken aback by the sudden shift in my tone. The quiet, terrifying certainty in my voice did not match the worn-out cardigan or the cheap sneakers. For a fraction of a second, a shadow of doubt crossed his face. But his monumental ego instantly crushed it. He was too deeply entrenched in his own delusion to recognize the very real threat staring him in the face. Vance quickly moved on, peppering me with dozens of invasive, aggressive questions about my daily schedule, my non-existent social life, and my ability to handle unexpected emergencies. I answered every single question with vague, carefully constructed truths. I admitted that I spent long hours working from home. I admitted that I maintained a very small private circle of associates. I admitted that I handled all of my legal and financial affairs independently. Every answer I gave perfectly reinforced their belief that I was a lonely, isolated woman typing away at some pathetic remote customer service job. They were aggressively digging their own graves, entirely convinced they were burying me. After 2 grueling hours, Vance closed his file with a loud, dramatic snap. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, with a look of absolute victory. I think we have established everything we need here today, he announced loudly, ensuring Chloe caught the moment on her phone. The facts are clear. The mother is destitute, physically limited, and entirely unequipped to provide a proper life for this child. We will be moving forward with the formal hearing next week, and we expect a swift, decisive ruling in favor of my client. Marcus packed up his disorganized briefcase, dropping papers on the floor, and scrambling to pick them up, playing the bumbling fool right until the very end. I stood up slowly, keeping my head bowed, acting as though the deposition had completely broken my spirit. As I turned to leave the room, I caught sight of Julian leaning closely into his lawyer. Julian's eyes were practically glowing with greedy anticipation. He was already calculating how quickly he could funnel my child support checks into his depleted bank accounts. This is going to be a slaughter, Julian whispered to Vance, a wide, arrogant smile spreading across his face. She has absolutely nothing left to fight with. The judge is going to hand Maya over in 10 minutes, and we are going to drain her dry. Vance chuckled, clapping Julian on the shoulder. It is a slam dunk, my friend. She practically handed us the case today. I walked out of the conference room, my cheap rubber soles squeaking slightly on the polished floor. I kept my head down until I reached the elevator bank. The metal doors slid shut, cutting me off from the toxic, suffocating presence of the Pierce family. The moment the elevator began its descent, the slumped, defeated posture completely vanished. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back. The phantom billionaire returned instantly. I looked over at Marcus. He had completely dropped the act of the incompetent lawyer. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and fiercely focused. He straightened his tie and let out a long, highly satisfied breath. They swallowed the bait whole, Marcus said, a predatory smile matching my own. They did not question a single financial disclosure. They genuinely believe you are completely broke. I reached into my canvas tote bag and pulled out my encrypted smartphone, immediately firing off a message to my acquisitions team to finalize the takeover of Julian's former firm. "They see exactly what they want to see, Marcus," I replied, watching the floor numbers drop on the digital display. "Their arrogance is their fatal flaw. They are so obsessed with appearances that they never bother to look at the actual foundation." We stepped out of the elevator and into the blazing Atlanta heat. A sleek black armored SUV from K&M Holdings was already waiting for us at the curb, a stark contrast to the beat-up Honda I had driven to the deposition. The driver opened the heavy door, and I stepped inside the luxurious leather interior, welcoming me back to reality. "Julian thinks next week is going to be a slaughter," I said, leaning back into the plush leather seat as the SUV pulled away from the curb. "And he is absolutely right." I looked out the tinted window at the towering skyscrapers of my city. "I am going to let him step right into that courtroom, swear his lies under oath, and then I am going to legally and financially annihilate him." The morning of the deposition arrived with a suffocating muggy Atlanta heat. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, carefully reviewing my armor for the day. I slipped into a faded, oversized gray cardigan that had begun to pill noticeably at the elbows. I paired it with loose, unflattering denim jeans and the exact same scuffed white sneakers I wore to Maya's elementary school. I brushed my hair into a limp, messy bun at the nape of my neck and completely bypassed my makeup vanity, allowing the natural dark circles from my late nights of corporate acquisitions to show through. I looked defeated. I looked exhausted. I looked exactly like the broken, impoverished victim Julian desperately needed me to be. Marcus met me outside the generic glass-fronted building of the opposing law firm. He was an elite, high-powered corporate shark, but today he was playing a role right alongside me. He wore a slightly rumpled suit he had bought off the rack specifically for this occasion. He carried a battered leather briefcase bursting with disorganized loose papers. We looked like a desperate single mother and an overworked bargain bin attorney entirely out of our depth. We walked into the sterile, heavily air-conditioned conference room. The suffocating smell of cheap cologne and expensive perfume hit me instantly. Julian sat at the center of the long table, leaning back in his chair with an air of absolute unearned arrogance. He wore a flashy, tailored suit that I knew he could not actually afford, a desperate attempt to project the wealth he had already lost. Next to him sat his lawyer, a sharp-featured, aggressively loud man named Vance, who operated a high-volume, low-quality divorce mill. In the corner of the room, arranged on a row of uncomfortable plastic chairs, sat Julian's personal cheering section. Chloe was perched on the edge of her seat, holding a counterfeit designer handbag on her lap. She had her smartphone propped up against a coffee cup, the camera lens pointed directly at me. She was poorly hiding the fact that she was recording the deposition, no doubt gathering content for a viral social media video about dealing with a broke, toxic baby mama. Beside her sat Vivian and Tasha. Vivian wore her signature pink and green, her eyes scanning my faded cardigan with naked disgust. As I pulled out my chair to sit next to Marcus, the whispering began. Tasha leaned into Vivian, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my feet. "Look at those hideous sneakers," Tasha hissed, her voice loud enough to echo across the silent room. "She literally looks like she just crawled out of a dumpster. I cannot believe Julian ever touched that." Vivian let out a harsh, condescending laugh. "It is pathetic," Vivian whispered back, her eyes locked on my plain canvas tote bag. "She could not even afford a proper attorney. Look at that clown sitting next to her. They are going to get absolutely crushed." I kept my head bowed, my shoulders slumped in a posture of complete submission. I let the insults wash over me. Their arrogance was blinding them to reality. The deposition began with Vance slamming a thick stack of papers onto the table. He leaned aggressively forward, attempting to intimidate me with his sheer volume. "We are here to establish the undeniable fact that you are entirely unfit to provide a stable, enriching, and financially secure environment for Maya." Pierce Vance barked, pointing a thick finger in my direction. "Let us start with your living situation. You reside in a small, outdated two-bedroom property in a low-income sector, correct?" I looked up, letting a brief flash of manufactured hesitation cross my face. "I live in a modest brick house. I answered softly, my voice barely above a whisper. It is safe and comfortable. Vance let out a sharp, mocking laugh. Modest is a very generous word, he sneered. My client lives in a multi-million-dollar secure suburban estate with a pool and top-tier security. He offers an environment of absolute privilege. You, on the other hand, are currently unemployed and surviving on government assistance, are you not? Marcus shuffled his papers frantically, playing the part of the disorganized, overwhelmed lawyer perfectly. He offered a weak, entirely unconvincing objection regarding the aggressive tone of the questioning. Vance ignored him completely, his eyes locked on me. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, refusing to break character. I have income that meets all of my needs, and Maya's needs, I stated vaguely. I am fully capable of providing for her daily expenses. Julian snorted loudly from across the table. He leaned over to Vance, a cruel, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. She means her disability checks. Julian whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. She is living off taxpayer handouts. The state pays for her groceries. Vance nodded enthusiastically, ready to twist the knife further. Let us discuss your physical capabilities, he continued, flipping to a new page in his file. You suffered a catastrophic spinal injury 5 years ago. You were told you would never walk unassisted again. How exactly do you plan to chase after an active 8-year-old child when your own medical records state you are permanently disabled? I took a slow, deep breath. I knew exactly what my medical records stated. I also knew that those records were 5 years old, and that my anonymous trust had completely scrubbed any recent medical updates from the public databases. They had absolutely no idea that I ran 5 miles every single morning. I chose my words with absolute terrifying precision. My physical state is exactly what the established medical records reflect. I answered truthfully. I manage my condition through sheer willpower and strict daily routines. I am fully capable of being an active presence in my daughter's life. In the corner, Chloe let out a loud, obnoxious scoff. She picked up her phone, turning the screen slightly to frame her own face. She whispered dramatically into the microphone, making sure to capture the audio of my quiet, subdued voice. You guys, it is so sad watching people refuse to accept reality, she murmured to her imaginary followers. Like, just give the kid to the parent who can actually afford to give her a good life. Some people are just so toxic and selfish. Vivian nodded in agreement, leaning forward to add her own commentary. It is child abuse, honestly, Vivian stated, her voice sharp and cruel. Forcing a bright young girl to live in squalor just because you want to play house. Julian is doing the Lord's work by rescuing her from that depressing little shack. Vance slammed his hand on the table again, refocusing the deposition. We have reviewed your initial financial disclosures, he said, pulling up a thin, single-page document. This document showed the balances of my decoy checking accounts containing just enough money to pay for groceries and basic utilities. It was a perfectly crafted illusion. You have 0 significant savings, 0 investment portfolios, and 0 viable assets. You are one unexpected medical bill away from total financial ruin. How do you intend to fund a child's future, her college tuition, her extracurricular activities, when you cannot even afford a decent pair of shoes? Tasha giggled in the corner, thoroughly enjoying the brutal interrogation. I looked down at my scuffed white sneakers, then back up at Vance. I maintain a strict budget, I replied, my voice steady, though I forced my hands to tremble slightly on the table. Financial security is about managing what you have, not flashing what you do not own. Julian's face flushed with sudden defensive anger. He took my comment as a direct insult to his lavish, entirely counterfeit lifestyle. Financial security is about having actual wealth, Julian snapped, leaning aggressively over the table. Something you know absolutely nothing about. I can give Maya the world. I can put her in private schools. I can take her on international vacations. You can barely afford to keep the lights on in that pathetic little brick house. You are holding her back, Kiara. You are drowning, and you are trying to drag my daughter down with you. I looked Julian directly in the eyes. For a split second, the facade of the terrified, broken victim slipped. I let him see a tiny, razor-sharp flash of the ruthless predator lurking just beneath the surface. "I do not drag people down, Julian," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing all its previous hesitation. "I wait for them to sink themselves." Julian blinked momentarily, taken aback by the sudden shift in my tone. The quiet, terrifying certainty in my voice did not match the worn-out cardigan or the cheap sneakers. For a fraction of a second, a shadow of doubt crossed his face. But his monumental ego instantly crushed it. He was too deeply entrenched in his own delusion to recognize the very real threat staring him in the face. Vance quickly moved on, peppering me with dozens of invasive, aggressive questions about my daily schedule, my non-existent social life, and my ability to handle unexpected emergencies. I answered every single question with vague, carefully constructed truths. I admitted that I spent long hours working from home. I admitted that I maintained a very small private circle of associates. I admitted that I handled all of my legal and financial affairs independently. Every answer I gave perfectly reinforced their belief that I was a lonely, isolated woman typing away at some pathetic remote customer service job. They were aggressively digging their own graves, entirely convinced they were burying me. After 2 grueling hours, Vance closed his file with a loud, dramatic snap. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest with a look of absolute victory. "I think we have established everything we need here today," he announced loudly, ensuring Chloe caught the moment on her phone. "The facts are clear. The mother is destitute, physically limited, and entirely unequipped to provide a proper life for this child. We will be moving forward with the formal hearing next week, and we expect a swift, decisive ruling in favor of my client." Marcus packed up his disorganized briefcase, dropping papers on the floor and scrambling to pick them up, playing the bumbling fool right until the very end. I stood up slowly, keeping my head bowed, acting as though the deposition had completely broken my spirit. As I turned to leave the room, I caught sight of Julian leaning closely into his lawyer. Julian's eyes were practically glowing with greedy anticipation. He was already calculating how quickly he could funnel my child support checks into his depleted bank accounts. "This is going to be a slaughter," Julian whispered to Vance, a wide, arrogant smile spreading across his face. "She has absolutely nothing left to fight with. The judge is going to hand Maya over in 10 minutes and we are going to drain her dry." Vance chuckled, clapping Julian on the shoulder. "It is a slam dunk, my friend. She practically handed us the case today." I walked out of the conference room, my cheap rubber soles squeaking slightly on the polished floor. I kept my head down until I reached the elevator bank. The metal doors slid shut, cutting me off from the toxic, suffocating presence of the Pierce family. The moment the elevator began its descent, the slumped, defeated posture completely vanished. I straightened my spine, pulling my shoulders back. The phantom billionaire returned instantly. I looked over at Marcus. He had completely dropped the act of the incompetent lawyer. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, and fiercely focused. He straightened his tie and let out a long, highly satisfied breath. "They swallowed the bait whole," Marcus said, a predatory smile matching my own. "They did not question a single financial disclosure. They genuinely believe you are completely broke." I reached into my canvas tote bag and pulled out my encrypted smartphone, immediately firing off a message to my acquisitions team to finalize the takeover of Julian's former firm. "They see exactly what they want to see, Marcus," I replied, watching the floor numbers drop on the digital display. "Their arrogance is their fatal flaw. They are so obsessed with appearances that they never bothered to look at the actual foundation." We stepped out of the elevator and into the blazing Atlanta heat. A sleek black armored SUV from K&M Holdings was already waiting for us at the curb, a stark contrast to the beat-up Honda I had driven to the deposition. The driver opened the heavy door, and I stepped inside the luxurious leather interior, welcoming me back to reality. "Julian thinks next week is going to be a slaughter," I said, leaning back into the plush leather seat as the SUV pulled away from the curb. And he is absolutely right. I looked out the tinted window at the towering skyscrapers of my city. I am going to let him step right into that courtroom, swear his lies under oath, and then I am going to legally and financially annihilate him. The heavy mahogany doors of the Atlanta family court swung open exactly 1 week later, admitting a rush of stale air and the overconfident swagger of the Pierce family. I sat quietly at the respondents' table dressed in a faded, shapeless navy blazer and the same unremarkable white sneakers I had worn to the deposition. Beside me, Marcus played his role perfectly nervously, organizing a chaotic stack of manila folders that looked entirely inadequate for a high-stakes custody trial. Julian made his entrance with the theatrical presence of a conquering king. He strutted down the center aisle wearing a sharply tailored deep charcoal Tom Ford suit, the fabric catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. He projected an aura of immense wealth and untouchable success, smoothing his expensive silk tie as he took his seat at the petitioner's table. Right beside him paraded Chloe, treating the solemn courtroom gallery like an exclusive VIP lounge. She clutched a bright orange Birkin bag, making sure to angle the logo outward for maximum visibility. My highly trained appraiser eyes instantly caught the uneven stitching along the leather handles and the overly shiny hardware. It was a spectacular, low-budget fake, a perfect reflection of their entire fraudulent existence. Vivian and Tasha trailed closely behind them, whispering loudly and casting venomous, pitying glares in my direction. Vivian had worn her finest Sunday church suit, complete with a pearl necklace and a matching hat, thoroughly prepared to play the role of the deeply concerned, devout grandmother. Tasha snapped a piece of bubblegum loudly, until a sharp, authoritative glare from the court bailiff forced her to quickly swallow it. They took their seats directly behind Julian, forming a unified front of toxic delusion. The side door near the bench opened and the bailiff instructed the entire courtroom to rise. Judge Rosalind Carter took the bench. She was a formidable, no-nonsense black woman with sharp, piercing eyes that immediately swept across the room, cataloging every single detail. She possessed a legendary reputation in the Atlanta legal circuit for having absolutely zero tolerance for grandstanding perjury or courtroom theatrics. She adjusted her reading glasses, opened the heavy case file, and firmly ordered Vance to call his first witness. Julian practically vaulted out of his leather chair. He marched to the witness stand with an arrogant spring in his step, raising his right hand and swearing to tell the whole truth. He settled into the wooden chair, adjusting his jacket cuffs and flashing a charming practiced smile directly at the judge. Judge Carter did not smile back. She merely stared at him, her expression an unreadable mask of cold judicial authority. Vance approached the podium, puffing out his chest to project dominance. "Please state your name and describe your current living situation for the court, Mr. Pierce." "My name is Julian Pierce." Julian began, his voice dropping into a deep, artificial resonance designed to convey authority. "I am a senior wealth management executive. I currently reside in a penthouse suite at the Pinnacle, the ultra-exclusive high-rise in the downtown financial district. My home offers state-of-the-art security premium private amenities and a completely stable, luxurious environment that is perfect for raising a growing child." I kept my head bowed over my yellow legal pad, hiding the cold, sharp smile that threatened to break across my face. The Pinnacle. It was indeed one of the most expensive high-rises in the entire city. What Julian absolutely did not know was that K&M Holdings had aggressively purchased the entire debt portfolio of that exact building just 2 months ago. The original development group had gone bankrupt, and my shell corporation now completely owned the deed. I also knew, for a confirmed, irrefutable fact, that Julian was currently renting a foreclosed unit in that building on a month-to-month lease, paying for it, using Chloe's maxed-out credit cards, because he could not pass a basic financial background check. He was sitting under oath, bragging about a luxury apartment in a building I literally owned. "And why are you seeking full physical custody of your daughter Maya today?" Vance asked, teeing up the next carefully rehearsed lie. Julian let his shoulders drop, painting a look of profound, agonizing fatherly concern across his face. "Because it breaks my heart to see how my daughter is forced to live," Julian said, his voice dripping with fake manufactured emotion. "Your Honor, I have built a thriving, incredibly successful life. I have the financial means to provide Maya with private tutors, international travel, and the absolute best healthcare money can buy. I want to give her the world." But currently, she is trapped in a completely pathetic, welfare-dependent existence. Vance nodded sympathetically, turning to look at me with manufactured disgust. Could you elaborate on the mother's living conditions? Julian turned his gaze directly toward me, his eyes flashing with raw, undisguised contempt. Kiara is completely destitute, he stated firmly, making sure his voice carried to the back row of the gallery. She lives in a crumbling, outdated brick shack in a terrible, unsafe neighborhood. She survives entirely on government handouts and disability checks. Because of her severe physical limitations and her total refusal to secure legitimate employment, she cannot provide a safe or enriching environment for an active child. She is isolating Maya in squalor. It is an unfit, impoverished, and deeply depressing existence. Maya deserves to live in luxury. Your Honor, not rot away in poverty just because her mother refuses to improve her station in life. I sat perfectly still. My pen glided smoothly across the lined paper, transcribing every single perjured statement, every manufactured boast, every arrogant lie he confidently presented to the court as an absolute fact. I did not flinch. I did not react. I simply let him keep digging his own grave deeper and deeper. Vance spent the next 40 minutes walking Julian through a complete fantasy world. Julian claimed he was actively managing millions of dollars in elite client portfolios. He claimed he and Chloe were in the final stages of setting up a massive, heavily funded college trust account for Maya. He testified under penalty of perjury that his income was steadily increasing every single quarter and that he was the only parent financially and physically capable of raising a child in this modern economy. When Vance finally finished, he looked incredibly smug. He called his next witness, Vivian Pierce. Vivian took the stand with the dramatic flair of a seasoned stage actress. She clutched her handbag tightly to her chest, her eyes wide and watery. Vance immediately guided her into the character of the deeply worried, heartbroken matriarch. Mrs. Pierce, have you personally witnessed the conditions in which your granddaughter is currently living? Vance asked gently, his tone laced with false compassion. Vivian dabbed at a completely dry eye with a lace tissue. I have, Your Honor, she lied smoothly, her voice shaking with fake distress. It is an absolute nightmare. I tried to visit Kiara last month to bring some new educational toys for little Maya. The house was an absolute disaster zone. There was no fresh food in the refrigerator, just expired cans. Maya was wearing dirty, ragged clothes that were far too small for her. Kiara could not even stand up out of her chair to properly cook a warm meal for the poor girl. I offered to help them financially, but Kiara is just so bitter and incredibly stubborn. She screamed at me and threw me out into the street. She is neglecting that sweet child, Your Honor. She simply cannot handle the physical demands of motherhood. It was a breathtaking, astonishing display of perjury. Vivian had not set foot near my house in 5 entire years. She did not even know my exact address until Julian had served the court papers. Yet she sat there under oath, inventing a vivid, horrifying story of squalor and neglect entirely out of thin air. Next up was Tasha. She swaggered to the witness stand, clearly loving the attention and the opportunity to tear me down publicly. Vance asked her to corroborate Vivian's claims. Oh, it is totally true, Tasha said, leaning aggressively into the microphone. I drove by the house a few weeks ago just to check on my niece. I saw Maya playing right next to a busy, dangerous street completely unsupervised. Kiara was just sitting inside, staring at a wall. She cannot run after her if something goes wrong. What if a car had jumped the curb? It is super dangerous. Plus, Kiara is always complaining to people around town about how broke she is. She cannot even afford basic cable or internet. It is a terrible, toxic environment for a kid to grow up in. I continued taking my meticulous notes, my posture completely unbothered. Beside me, Marcus occasionally let out a soft, theatrical sigh, burying his face in his hands to fully sell the illusion that we were getting absolutely destroyed by their powerful testimonies. Julian leaned back at the petitioner's table, crossing his arms and grinning broadly at his mother. He looked exactly like a man who had just won the lottery. He firmly believed the narrative they were spinning was completely bulletproof. He believed that Judge Carter was looking at me and seeing a helpless, negligent, disabled woman who deserved to have her child ripped away by the state. He was so intoxicated by his own spectacular performance that he completely failed to notice the subtle, dangerous shift in the courtroom dynamic. Judge Carter was not writing anything down. She was sitting perfectly straight, her hands steepled together on the desk. Her sharp, calculating eyes were moving deliberately from Julian to Vivian to Tasha, and finally resting on me. She was listening intently, her face a completely unreadable mask of stone. When Tasha finally stepped down from the stand, Vance puffed his chest out and addressed the judge with absolute confidence. Your Honor, the testimony today paints a very clear, deeply tragic picture. My client is a respected pillar of the financial community, offering a life of unmatched stability and wealth. The respondent is an impoverished, severely disabled woman living on the state's dime, entirely incapable of providing basic care. We humbly request that full physical and legal custody be transferred to Julian Pierce immediately. Furthermore, we request that the state guidelines for child support be strictly enforced to ensure Kiara contributes to Maya's care, however meager those disability contributions might actually be. Vance returned to his seat. Julian actually reached over and high-fived his lawyer, a smug laugh escaping his lips. Judge Carter let the silence stretch for a long, incredibly heavy moment. The tension in the room began to shift, growing thick and suffocating. She finally looked over at our table. Mr. Vance has presented his witnesses, she said, her voice cutting through the humid air of the courtroom like a sharp steel blade. Does the respondent wish to cross-examine or present witnesses of her own? Marcus stood up slowly. He adjusted his glasses, fumbling slightly with a file folder before looking up. Yes, Your Honor. Marcus said, his voice completely devoid of the bumbling hesitation he had displayed all morning. In fact, we have quite a few pressing questions regarding the extremely detailed financial testimony Mr. Pierce just provided to this court under oath. Vance let out a loud theatrical scoff, entirely missing the lethal shift in Marcus's posture. He waved a dismissive hand toward our table. You can ask whatever you want, Vance sneered, his voice dripping with overconfidence. My client has been completely transparent about his exceptional financial standing. We have absolutely nothing to hide. Marcus did not respond to the taunt. He smoothly unclasped his battered leather briefcase. The chaotic, disorganized mess of loose papers was gone. In its place rested a series of pristine, immaculately bound black folders. Marcus withdrew a thick sealed envelope stamped with official government seals. He walked purposefully toward the bench, the sound of his measured footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet of the courtroom. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice ringing with absolute chilling clarity. Before we begin our cross-examination of Mr. Pierce, I would like to formally submit the respondent's verified financial disclosures into the court record. These documents include fully audited federal tax returns, certified bank statements, and comprehensive corporate asset valuations for the past 5 fiscal years. Vance rolled his eyes so hard I thought he might strain a muscle. He slumped back in his chair, whispering something to Julian that made them both chuckle. They were entirely convinced Marcus was handing over a stack of food stamp applications and rejection letters from minimum wage jobs. Judge Carter accepted the heavy envelope from the bailiff. She broke the red wax seal with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the wood-paneled walls. She pulled out the thick stack of financial documents, adjusting her reading glasses as she flipped to the summary page. The courtroom was perfectly still. I watched Judge Carter's face closely. For a few seconds, her expression remained entirely blank. Then her eyes narrowed. She flipped back to the first page, reading it again. She turned to the second page, her index finger tracing a line of data. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the documents and looked over the rims of her glasses. She did not look at me. She looked directly at Julian. The arrogant smile on Julian's face began to falter under the sheer weight of her judicial glare. He shifted uncomfortably in his expensive tailored suit, glancing nervously at Vance. Mr. Pierce. Judge Carter began, her voice dangerously quiet and laced with a cold, terrifying edge. You sat in my courtroom today, under penalty of perjury, and painted a very vivid picture. You demanded $2,000 a month in child support from a woman you aggressively claimed was entirely destitute, physically helpless, and wholly reliant on the state for her survival. Julian puffed out his chest, attempting to maintain his facade of righteous authority. Yes, Your Honor, the respondent is completely impoverished. Maya is living in squalor. Judge Carter raised a single sharp eyebrow. She picked up the top sheet of my financial disclosure and held it up. Then perhaps you can explain this to me, Mr. Pierce, she said, her voice echoing like a thunderclap across the silent room. Because according to these fully audited IRS-verified tax returns, the destitute woman sitting across from you reported a net personal income of exactly $8.5 million last year alone. Absolute suffocating silence slammed into the courtroom. For 5 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The air itself seemed to freeze solid. Then absolute chaos erupted. Chloe let out a sharp, genuine gasp of shock. Her grip failed entirely. The bright orange fake Birkin bag slipped from her manicured fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a loud, hollow thud, spilling cheap lip gloss and maxed-out credit cards across the aisle. Vivian clutched her pearl necklace so violently I thought the string would snap. Her jaw unhinged, her eyes bulging out of her head as if she had just witnessed a ghost materialize in front of the judge. Tasha stopped chewing her gum, her mouth hanging wide open, her brain completely short-circuiting as she tried to process the words, $8.5 million. Julian lost every single drop of color in his face. His tanned, confident complexion instantly drained to a sickly, chalky white. He gripped the edge of the petitioner's table so hard his knuckles turned translucent. He stared at Judge Carter, his eyes wide with wild, unadulterated panic. No, Julian stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate wheeze. No, that is a typo. That is impossible. She does not have any money. She lives in a dump. She is a cripple. Judge Carter slammed her gavel down with terrifying force, the sharp crack silencing Julian's frantic babbling instantly. You will watch your language in my courtroom. Mr. Pierce, she barked, her eyes flashing with absolute fury. And I assure you there are no typos here. I am looking at certified federal tax documents, verified holdings in multiple commercial real estate trusts, and confirmed bank balances that exceed the gross domestic product of a small island nation. Vance scrambled out of his chair. His previous arrogance entirely evaporated. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine. Your Honor, I object, Vance shouted, his voice trembling with panic. These documents must be fraudulent. We demand an immediate recess to review these submissions. My client knows for a fact that the respondent is unemployed. Marcus turned smoothly on his heel and walked over to Vance. He handed the opposing lawyer a perfectly bound copy of my financial disclosures. Feel free to review them, Counselor Marcus said, his voice dripping with lethal professional courtesy. Every single page is certified by a top-tier forensic accounting firm. You will find that my client, Kiara Pierce, is the sole owner and acting CEO of K&M Holdings. Vance snatched the binder out of Marcus's hands. He flipped it open, his eyes frantically scanning the pages. I watched in deep, profound satisfaction as Vance physically deflated. His shoulders slumped, his jaw went slack, and a bead of sweat broke out on his forehead. He looked at the list of commercial properties my firm owned. He looked at the massive multi-million-dollar asset valuations. He looked at the undeniable ironclad proof that he had just walked his client straight into a catastrophic legal slaughter. Vance slowly lowered the binder, turning to look at Julian with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Julian, you told me she was on welfare, Vance hissed through gritted teeth, entirely forgetting to keep his voice down. Julian was hyperventilating. He looked at me across the room, his eyes wide and pleading desperately, searching for the terrified, broken woman he had left on the curb 5 years ago. He did not find her. I dropped the act entirely. I sat up straight, pushing my shoulders back and lifting my chin. The invisible, heavy mantle of the phantom billionaire settled perfectly over my faded cardigan. I looked Julian dead in the eyes. I did not blink. I let the cold, calculating predator inside me rise to the surface, showing him the absolute terrifying power I had spent 5 years cultivating in the shadows. I watched the terrifying realization wash over him. He finally understood that he had not been hunting prey. He had been blindly walking into a trap of unimaginable proportions. Judge Carter leaned forward, resting her arms on the bench. She fixed her steely gaze directly on Julian, who was now sweating profusely through his expensive suit. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "you initiated this highly aggressive custody modification. You brought this mother into my court, and you testified under oath that she was destitute, neglecting her child, and completely incapable of providing financial security. You submitted sworn affidavits claiming you were stepping in to rescue your daughter from systemic poverty." Julian opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his exposure. "Now I am sitting here looking at proof that the respondent is a multimillionaire corporate executive," Judge Carter continued, her voice rising in volume and intensity. "I am looking at testimony from you and your family that appears to be entirely fabricated. You have weaponized this court, Mr. Pierce. You have committed what appears to be blatant coordinated perjury in an attempt to extract child support from a woman who could buy and sell you 10 times over." Vivian let out a loud, pathetic whimper from the gallery. Chloe was frantically trying to gather her spilled credit cards, her hands shaking violently. The perfect, wealthy illusion they had sold to the world was completely disintegrating in front of a furious judge. "Your Honor." Vance stammered desperately, trying to salvage his own legal career from the wreckage of his client's massive lie. "My client may have been misinformed regarding the respondent's current employment status. We were operating under outdated information." Marcus let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed through the courtroom. "Outdated information," Marcus repeated, turning to face Vance. "That is a fascinating defense, counselor. Because if we are discussing outdated information and financial transparency, I believe it is time we turn our attention to the petitioner's actual financial disclosures." Julian's head snapped toward Marcus, his eyes bulging with a brand new, even more profound terror. He had completely forgotten that by opening the door to financial discovery, he had invited us to look into his own bank accounts. Marcus walked back to our table and pulled a second thick black folder from his briefcase. He held it up for the judge to see. "Your Honor, my client has been entirely transparent," Marcus announced, his voice ringing with righteous authority. "But it appears Mr. Pierce has been exceptionally creative with his own financial declarations. He sat on that stand and swore to you that he was a wealthy, thriving executive providing a life of luxury for his daughter. He swore he was financially superior to my client." Marcus walked over to the bench and handed the second folder directly to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Carter. "I would like to submit Respondent's Exhibit B," Marcus stated coldly, turning his gaze back to Julian. "These are the certified subpoenaed financial records for Julian Pierce. I believe the court will find them extremely illuminating, especially considering his demands for $2,000 a month in child support." Julian gripped his hair with trembling hands, a low groan escaping his throat. He knew exactly what was in that folder. He knew the absolute slaughter had only just begun. I sat quietly at my table, my hands folded elegantly, a serene smile resting on my lips. The trap had snapped shut, and I was about to watch Julian Pierce lose everything he had ever valued. Judge Carter broke the heavy wax seal on the second folder with a sharp, echoing crack. The thick silence in the courtroom returned heavy and suffocating as she flipped through the pages. Her expression, already stern from the previous revelation, hardened into an absolute mask of judicial wrath. She looked from the financial papers directly to Julian, her eyes practically boring a hole through his skull. "Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. "I am looking at a series of highly concerning documents. I am looking at foreclosure notices on your former suburban property. I am looking at 6 different maxed-out credit cards bearing your name, all currently in active collections. I am looking at a formal termination letter from your former wealth management firm citing gross financial misconduct and the embezzlement of client funds. Are these documents accurate?" Julian opened his mouth, his jaw working uselessly. He looked at Vance for help, but his aggressively confident lawyer had physically shifted his chair away from his client. Vance was furiously packing his battered briefcase, mentally calculating exactly how fast he could run from this career-ending disaster. "Your Honor, I can explain. Julian choked out, sweat pouring down his forehead and soaking the crisp collar of his Tom Ford suit. Marcus stepped right up to the podium, his posture radiating absolute dominance. "There is nothing to explain, Your Honor," Marcus declared, his voice ringing with theatrical authority. "Mr. Pierce sits before you completely bankrupt. He has zero legitimate income. He has zero liquid assets. He orchestrated this entire custody modification in a desperate, malicious attempt to secure my client's child support payments, to fund his fraudulent lifestyle, and pay off his crippling debts." Julian gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning bone white. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. "But that is not even the most egregious lie told in this courtroom today," Marcus continued, turning his body to look directly at Julian. "Mr. Pierce boasted at length on the witness stand about providing a stable, luxurious home for his daughter at the Pinnacle high-rise. He claimed this premium environment was undeniable proof of his superior ability to parent. He claimed my client was unfit because she could not provide such lavish accommodations." Judge Carter leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she anticipated the final strike. "Go on, counselor," she instructed firmly. "What Mr. Pierce conveniently failed to mention is that he does not own a penthouse suite," Marcus announced, his voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. "He is renting a foreclosed unit on a month-to-month lease. Furthermore, he is currently 4 months behind on his rent. He is facing imminent removal from the very building he just used to justify taking a child away from her mother." A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. Vivian clutched her pearl necklace so violently, I thought the string would shatter. Tasha sat frozen, her bubblegum entirely forgotten. But Marcus was not quite finished. He looked back at the judge, the corners of his mouth twitching into a predatory smirk. "And there is one final crucial detail regarding his residence," Marcus said, letting the suspense hang in the sterile air. "The Pinnacle high-rise is wholly owned and operated by K&M Holdings. My client Kiara Washington is the chief executive officer and sole owner of that building." The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up. I let the faded, oversized cardigan slip slightly from my shoulders as I drew myself up to my full height. I did not look at the judge. I did not look at Vivian or Tasha. I looked dead into Julian's terrified, bloodshot eyes. I let him see the phantom billionaire he had blindly chosen to wage war against. And as the landlord, I said, my voice carrying a lethal, unwavering calm, "I signed your eviction notice this morning at exactly 8 o'clock. Julian collapsed into his chair. It was a total physical and mental surrender. All the air left his lungs in a single ragged wheeze. He slumped forward, his face burying into his trembling hands. The arrogant, untouchable wealth management executive was gone, replaced entirely by a broken, destitute fraud who had just realized he was completely homeless at the hands of the woman he had discarded. Then the true chaos erupted. Chloe sprang up from her plastic chair in the back row like she had been electrocuted. Her face was contorted with a mixture of raw horror and explosive fury. She had just connected the dots. The fake designer bags, the maxed-out credit cards, the sudden lack of funds for her luxury spa days. The entire glamorous influencer lifestyle she had built her identity around was a complete and utter lie. She was tied to a broke, unemployed criminal who was about to be thrown out onto the street. "You are broke," Chloe shrieked, her voice shattering the solemn decorum of the courtroom. Her carefully curated influencer persona vanished instantly. "You lied to me. You told me you were a millionaire. You told me those bags were real. You are entirely broke." Julian flinched, refusing to look up from his hands. Chloe let out a sound of pure disgust. She picked up her flashy orange Birkin bag and violently hurled it directly at Julian's head. The heavy fake leather smacked against his shoulder, spilling cheap lip gloss, a cracked compact mirror, and a handful of declined credit cards across the polished wooden floor. "I am not staying with a broke loser," Chloe screamed, turning on her heel and stomping toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. "I am done. You can pack your own garbage when they throw you out of that apartment." The heavy door slammed shut behind her, leaving a ringing silence in her wake. Vivian sat in the gallery, her face an ashen mask of pure humiliation. The elitist matriarch who had pawned her antique jewelry to fund this malicious lawsuit was completely ruined. She had proudly committed perjury, spinning a fictional tale of my poverty, only to discover I possessed more wealth than her entire bloodline combined. She clutched her gold-embossed Bible to her chest, hyperventilating as the terrifying reality of her son's complete destruction washed over her. Tasha sank lower into her chair, desperately trying to become invisible. "Order in this court!" Judge Carter roared, slamming her gavel down with enough force to make Julian physically jump in his seat. The sharp, violent crack restored immediate silence to the room. Judge Carter stood up, leaning over the high wooden bench. Her eyes blazed with a righteous, terrifying judicial fury. She pointed her gavel directly at Julian. "Mr. Pierce, you have made an absolute mockery of this legal institution," she thundered, her voice echoing with unmistakable disgust. "You walked into my courtroom and committed blatant, coordinated perjury. You manufactured a completely fraudulent narrative to steal money from a mother who has clearly provided an exceptional life for your daughter. You attempted to weaponize the child support system to fund your own disastrous financial failings." She turned her searing glare toward the gallery, locking eyes with Vivian. "And you, Mrs. Pierce, you sat on that witness stand, swore an oath to God, and fabricated a malicious, deeply offensive story about the living conditions of your own granddaughter. You lied to this court to facilitate your son's financial extortion." Vivian shrank back, burying her face in her hands, entirely unable to withstand the judge's wrath. "I am denying this petition for a custody modification with extreme prejudice," Judge Carter announced, her words striking like physical blows. "The current custody arrangement remains entirely unchanged. Furthermore, I am ordering you, Mr. Pierce, to pay every single cent of the respondent's legal fees incurred during this sham of a trial." Julian let out another pathetic groan. He had absolutely no money to pay his own discount lawyer, let alone my elite corporate legal team. He was buried alive. "But I am not finished," Judge Carter added, her voice dropping into a deadly promising calm. "I am forwarding the transcripts of today's proceedings, along with these falsified financial affidavits, directly to the district attorney's office. I strongly recommend they review this case for multiple counts of perjury and attempted fraud. You will be very lucky, Mr. Pierce, if you do not end up sharing a prison cell with the people you embezzled from." She struck the sounding block with one final resounding crack of her gavel. "This court is adjourned." Judge Carter swept out of the room, leaving absolute devastation in her wake. Marcus calmly gathered our perfectly organized documents, sliding them back into his briefcase with a highly satisfied smile. He turned to me and offered a slight, respectful nod. The slaughter was complete. We had walked into an ambush and entirely reversed the execution. I picked up my canvas tote bag and smoothed the front of my faded cardigan. I walked slowly toward the center aisle, my cheap white sneakers making no sound on the floor. I stopped directly beside the petitioner's table. Julian was still slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the scattered contents of Chloe's fake designer bag. He looked completely shattered, a hollow, empty shell of a man who had finally met his match. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face close to his ear. I kept my voice incredibly soft, ensuring only he could hear the final fatal truth. "I told you, I do not drag people down, Julian," I whispered, savoring the absolute terror that flickered in his bloodshot eyes. "I told you I wait for them to sink themselves. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my building." I straightened up and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. I did not look at Vivian. I did not look at Tasha. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out into the bright sunlit hallway of the courthouse. I had spent 5 years waiting for this exact moment. I had endured the pain, the secrecy, and the endless grueling work of building an empire in the dark. I walked out of the building and stepped into the back of my waiting armored SUV. I instructed my driver to take me back to my modest brick house. I had a daughter waiting for me, a brilliant, thriving little girl who would never have to worry about the toxic poison of the Pierce family ever again. The war was officially over, and the phantom billionaire had won. As I settled into the plush, pristine leather seats of my custom Maybach SUV, The glorious weight of my absolute victory washed over me. Before Judge Carter had slammed her gavel to adjourn the court, she had delivered a final lethal strike that completely obliterated Julian's future. She did not merely deny his fraudulent petition. Disgusted by his blatant perjury and his malicious attempt to weaponize the legal system, the judge had officially stripped Julian of any remaining parental rights, granting me sole physical and legal custody of Maya permanently. Furthermore, to ensure his absolute financial ruin, the judge had ordered a full retroactive audit of his finances from the very day of our divorce. She slapped him with 5 years of maximum tier-back child support calculated during the peak of his wealth management career. Coupled with the mandate to cover every single penny of my exorbitant corporate legal fees, Julian was now chained to a mountain of debt he could never possibly repay. He was legally, financially, and socially ruined. Before my driver could ease the massive vehicle away from the courthouse curb, the heavy glass doors of the building burst open violently. I tapped the glass partition, signaling my driver to wait. I wanted to witness every single second of the fallout. Julian stumbled out into the blinding Atlanta sunlight looking physically ill. His expensive Tom Ford suit suddenly looked like a cheap costume on a broken man. Right on his heels was Chloe. She had clearly waited by the exit to deliver her final devastating blow. Chloe spun around, her face twisted in pure, unadulterated revulsion. She screamed at him, her voice echoing sharply across the concrete plaza, berating him for making her look like a fool and stringing her along in a fake, bankrupt fantasy. Julian reached out desperately, pleading with her to stay, stammering pathetic promises that he could somehow fix this disaster. Chloe let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She furiously pulled off her engagement ring, a gaudy stone that was undoubtedly just as fake as the Birkin bag she had left scattered on the courtroom floor. She threw it directly at Julian's chest. It struck his lapel and clattered sharply onto the hot pavement. Without a single backward glance, she turned and marched into a waiting taxi, abandoning Julian completely. But the pathetic spectacle was far from over. Vivian and Tasha shoved their way through the courthouse doors next. Vivian looked utterly unhinged. Her pristine church hat sat crookedly on her head, and her expensive mascara was running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. Her wild eyes scanned the crowded curb until they locked directly onto my gleaming Maybach. The elitist pride and suffocating arrogance that had defined her entire miserable existence evaporated, instantly replaced by raw, primal panic. She recognized the sheer power of the vehicle and the devastating reality of the woman sitting inside it. Abandoning every last shred of her precious dignity, Vivian sprinted across the concrete, dragging a terrified Tasha by the arm. They desperately ran after my waiting car. Vivian slammed her manicured hands flat against the tinted glass of my rear window. "Kiara, please. We're family. Don't throw my son out on the street." I stared at her through the dark tint, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, satisfying indifference. This was the exact same woman who had conspired to steal my child, who had mocked my paralysis, and who had gleefully plotted to drain my bank accounts just hours prior. I pressed the silver button on my armrest. The heavy bulletproof window rolled down just enough to expose me to the humid air and the sound of her frantic weeping. I reached into the bottom of my canvas tote bag and retrieved a small tarnished object. It was the cheap fake gold ring Tasha had ripped off my finger while I lay helpless in my hospital bed 5 years ago. I had hired a private investigator to track it down and buy it back from a local pawn shop specifically for this very moment. I flicked my wrist, tossing the worthless band through the open window. It hit the pavement right at Vivian's feet with a pathetic, dull clink. "Use that for the deposit on a motel. The Pierce family doesn't finance dead weight." I did not wait for her reaction. I pressed the button and the window rolled up smoothly, permanently sealing out her hysterical wailing and severing my connection to their toxic existence. "Drive." I instructed my security detail softly. The Maybach pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the heavy city traffic, leaving Julian, Vivian, and Tasha choking on the exhaust of their own spectacular ruin. We did not drive back to the modest 2-bedroom brick house on the outskirts of the city. That house had served its purpose perfectly, as the ultimate decoy, a flawless stage set designed entirely to trap Julian in his own arrogant assumptions. I instructed my driver to take me home, to my actual home. The Maybach glided into the secure subterranean parking garage of the Pinnacle, the ultra-exclusive high-rise I wholly owned. I stepped out of the vehicle and entered my private biometric elevator, ascending directly to the crowning jewel of the skyscraper. The elevator doors slid open, revealing my sprawling multi-level penthouse. The space was a breathtaking sanctuary of imported marble, soaring 30-foot ceilings and walls of pure glass that offered an unobstructed 360-degree view of the city. Maya was already there, playing happily in the center of the massive living room. When she heard the elevator chime, she spun around, her dark curls bouncing. She ran across the polished stone floor, a bright, radiant smile illuminating her face. I dropped my canvas tote bag and knelt down, catching her in my arms and holding her tighter than I ever had before. I buried my face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the absolute undeniable security of our new reality. She was safe. She was protected. She would never know the pain of being discarded by the people who were supposed to love her. I stood up, holding Maya's hand, and walked out onto the massive wraparound glass balcony. The warm evening wind whipped around us as the sun began to set, painting the Atlanta skyline in brilliant shades of gold, crimson, and deep violet. I looked out over the towering glass monoliths, the sprawling commercial districts, and the bustling city streets pulsing with life below. I had started this journey completely broken, paralyzed, and discarded like trash in the rain. I had fought through unimaginable agony, operating in absolute silence, turning my trauma into an unstoppable, ruthless ambition. Now I stood at the very top of the world, hugging a smiling Maya, looking out over the Atlanta skyline I now owned. The phantom billionaire had stepped out of the shadows, and my reign had only just begun.